Most of our work, and I think probably most of the work with the GALs as well, is the same population. It's kids that have come through the child welfare system, kids who have been abused and neglected. Cheyenne and I did an intake together last night about a little boy who was a poster child for this training. So I told her her timing was perfect to come into this training today, because this little guy came into the office with his adopted father, and he's not even 4 years old yet. He's going to be 4 in a couple of days. But the first 3 years of his life were incredibly impacted by neglect. I'm looking at probably the typical case that you all deal with every day, which are drug addicted parents, unable to attend to the basic needs of their babies. There's kids that are found outside on the highway in their onesie at 2 o'clock in the morning, and nobody knows where they came from. But this little guy just had almost no care in the first 3 years of his life, and had gone in and out of foster care several times. And in talking to his adopted father, they've had him for a year, and they had done all kinds of things right, which I always like to see. And they had just done a lot of things intuitively that really had helped him catch up, because as he was trying to describing the behaviors of this little boy, he just said he just didn't expect anything of us. And that is what happens with kids who've had no care. They just don't expect anything of the adults in their life. So that's kind of hard for adoptive parents, isn't it? Because adoptive parents are right there, and they're right there to love these kids, and they want these kids to love them back. And then when that doesn't happen, it sets up difficulties in the adoption, which is why we do so much adoption work. But in trying to talk to this dad yesterday, I just said to him, you're describing the way this little boy was when he came to you when he was 2.5, and now he's almost 4. And look at all the things that you have done to remediate his inability to accept care from you. And then there's the more obvious things. These kids usually have speech delays. Why do they have speech delays? Because nobody's talked to them. You learn how to talk because somebody talks to you. So we do this training about the effects of trauma on brain development at the beginning of every year. And I always ask my new therapists to come to this, because it's the underpinnings of all of our work. And I sent out, actually, I see Sandy is on the call. Sandy, I will send you our training calendar for 2025 when this is over. I don't think I did send it to you yesterday.
Thank you very much.
Sure, no problem. We're always happy to have you guys. But the reason I sent it out to my staff yesterday is that I want you to see that we start with this understanding of what happens to little kids when their brains are not stimulated in any way in the first 3 to 5 years of their life. And then the other trainings that we do subsequent to that are really based on, well, what do you do? If a child really is not used to having any kind of care, what do we as therapists do? What specific techniques are we teaching you to use? Why are we teaching you how to do sand tray or art therapy or the pictorial timeline? Or why are we talking about all of these ways to remediate brain damage in kids? So that's why we start with this. Now, for those of you who are not used to coming into our trainings, I absolutely am so happy that you have put your cameras on, because it's very hard to look at a sea of black screens. And if anybody has anything that they want to say, all you need to do, oh, here's Andrea, hold on a second. All you need to do is unmute and raise your hand and say whatever you want to say. My staff are used to listening to me, but maybe they might like to hear somebody else's voice once in a while. So I am going to share the screen. Okay, can everybody see the screen? Working with the maltreated child, the effects of trauma on the developing brain. Very good. Okay.
Yes.
I've done this training a lot. Actually, I was talking about it last night because my husband and I started Circle of Friends in 2009. And when you're starting an agency, you do a lot of this stuff to give yourself away so that people will know that you exist. So I think this was one of the very first trainings that I developed in 2009. And now everybody does them. You go to the summit, there's all kinds of trainings up there about this topic. But in 2009, it didn't seem like there were a lot of people that were really focusing on this. And I have updated it. I keep it updated along the line. I want to make sure that anything I'm training you in is current and updated material. But the basic message here has never changed. I've been working in child welfare. I've done case management. I've been a CPI. I've been a GAL. I've been a therapist. I've been working with child welfare kids since probably the 80s. I'm probably the oldest person in the room. But the basic effects of trauma I can see over the years have always been constant. What happens to kids when they are not cared for, the effects are fairly constant. What I didn't know when I started doing this work in the late 70s, early 80s, was that there was actual brain damage attached to this. So as we at Circle of Friends continue to work in this field, and again, that's why I'm so happy to see the GALs come to us. We all have to work together to understand that these kids are not just behaving badly. These kids are kids that are behaving in ways that their brains are teaching them to behave. Now, one of the things I said to this dad yesterday was that the good news here is that your little guy isn't even 4 years old, and we can remediate brain damage. That's the good news, and that's the message you need to take away from this, is that you can fix this. The brain, the very little baby brain, is very plastic, and it can be molded, and you can improve, and you can make improvements to the baby brain. But hold on a second. Hold on. Hey, Daisy, I'm doing a training.
Oh, okay, no problem. We'll talk later. Thank you.
All right, I'll call you later. Thanks, bye. I'm sorry, folks. What you need to always put in front of your clients is what I said to this dad yesterday, that you've done a good job, you've done it intuitively, you've recognized that little temper tantrums or blow-ups or things that he does are not bad behavior. They're just the fact that he's just not used to having to, number one, transition. It's hard enough for little guys to go into new daycare centers and new schools and new pre-Ks and all of that. But this little boy had had 5 placements before he was placed with this couple last year. So a lot of what they have done, they've done the work on their own. We're kind of picking up the gravy at the end. But the good news is that if we understand this, we can make it better. So I think we have everybody, which is nothing short of a modern miracle. Usually there's always some straggler that dithers in, but it looks like we've got everybody. So let's talk about maltreated kids, because the methods of maltreatment have changed a little bit over the years. When I was first doing this work, I was in, where would I start? I think I started in upstate New York, and I was a case social worker, case manager, and it was very rural. If you know anything about that part of New York State, it's very rural, it's very mountainous, it's the Adirondacks, it's a lot of little hill towns with people stuck in little hill towns. And I used to call them incest towns because at that point, the thing that we were just getting to see, what was coming in to us as social workers working for, it was DCF at the time, were kids that had been molested. It was mostly incest families. As time went on, and if you want the history of maltreatment, I can give it to you. As time went on, we got into the 80s. Crack cocaine didn't hit the streets until the 80s. But by the time it did, then we had a whole different kind of maltreatment. And we had a lot of abysmal neglect. So a lot of the work that I did first as a case manager and then as a therapist in private practice is that I worked a lot with the kids that had been sexually abused. And I worked a lot with kids who had had multiple placements because of, quotes, bad behaviors. And these kids weren't behaving badly. These kids were doing what they knew how to do. But here we are, it's 2025. What do we have now? What's the main reason that kids are coming into care now? It's the number one ticket to get kids into foster care now is opioids. So this little guy that I looked at yesterday is an opioid child. He's a child that had no care at all. And that's a different kind of maltreatment. No care at all is a very different kind of maltreatment. But we always know that there's always some real common denominators with maltreated kids. They all have these things. And with most of our kids that are coming into care, uh, when I look at the intakes for our kids, I always look at what happened to them in the first 5 years of their life. Even if they come to us when they're 14 or 15, I read the comprehensive behavioral health assessments. I make sure I know what happened in those early years because almost all the kids that we are now working with at our agency, and I'm sure the GALs are interacting with on a daily basis, have all of this stuff. They've got early onset trauma. There are very few kids that come in that we cannot find that the first 5 years of their life were fraught with something. Um, Separation from caregivers is almost always a given. We are often searching for fathers that we don't know where they are. We don't know if they know that they have these kids. We're looking at kids that have had multiple placements, including this little boy who had 5 placements before he came into his adoptive home. And where do those multiple placements come from? They come from the last thing on this list. They come from chaotic child welfare systems. For those of you who go to the Florida Children's Summit, or whatever we're calling it these days, the Child Welfare Summit, the Children's Summit, it's the one that we have in September. And we get the secretary up on the stage, and this last time we had Governor DeSantis up on the stage, and they all talk about how wonderful the Florida child welfare system is and how advanced we are compared to other states. And that may be true. We may be advanced from other states, but it's still chaotic. It's still what it is. It's just the nature of child welfare and it's the nature of the foster care system. It's an imperfect solution to a very imperfect problem. And do we all do the best that we can do? I think we do. But when I look at the kids that I have that we're working with, I see all of this. Um, but I also see that the chaos of the child welfare system is one of the things that impacts our kids. Because if you think about it, if you go out to meet your kid, whether you're a GAL or a therapist or whatever, and you find how many placements they've had, what is involved with those placements? They're new beds to sleep in, they're new people to get used to, it's a new daycare center, it's sometimes a new school, it's a new therapist, it's a new case manager, it's all new people. And we were trying to explain to Cheyenne and I last night to this little boy that now he's going to come here and we're going to try to help him. And I thought he was remarkably accepting of that. But I think at his little age, he's just used to the chaos of people coming and going. And that's one of the things that the dad said to me, what we decided to do was to keep him home instead of everybody kept saying put him in daycare, but every time he went to the daycare, the transition was so difficult that he would then act up. So the place where he was the most grounded was at home. So they made the decision to try to keep him home and then introduce the daycare center gradually. Um, I like working with parents like that. It's a lot easier than the ones that say he was fine when I first adopted him, but now he's 11 and I can't stand him. And we get a lot of those very disillusioned adoptive parents. So, but we see this. Tell me you don't see this with all of the kids that you have. They all have this. So if we look at that, what do we know about the effects of trauma on kids, we absolutely know scientifically something that I didn't have the advantage of knowing 20 years ago. We absolutely know that early trauma is going to affect brain development. And separation from caretakers is going to affect brain development. And all of our kids are separated from their caretakers. Whether those caretakers are pathogenic caretakers, whether they're crappy caretakers, they're separated from them. Um, we have a saying, because we do infant mental health at Circle of Friends, that there is no such thing as a baby. There's a baby and someone. And what does that mean? That to me explains everything I'm going to tell you this morning. Because if you are a baby, what can you do for yourself? Absolutely nothing. You can't feed yourself. You can't take care of your diaper. You can't do anything for yourself. You have to have a someone to do that. And um, one of the things that we see with the opioid babies is that there's no someone. If these parents are both using drugs and they're leaving the baby in the crib, or they're leaving the baby in the room and shutting the door, um, that's not a someone. Those are kids that don't get any kind of care at all. Our kids that we're working with often didn't have someone. So our job as therapists, our job as GALs is to say, I want to be that someone. And rather than getting discouraged by this, I think you have to understand, or try to believe, that for every kid that we pull through the child welfare system, maybe there was one someone. Maybe you were the one someone that was able to help them, was able to help them believe that they were worth something. Um, Cells that fire together, wire together, is Donald Hebbs. He's passed away now, but he's a psychologist from the 50s who really believed that that connection between the caretaker and the baby was neurological and intrinsic, and that if the baby had a someone, the baby was going to thrive. Um, but you can be that someone. And I digress and tell this story, but when I first moved here from Massachusetts, I worked at Florida United Methodist Children's Home as a therapist. And a couple of years ago, and I'm talking 1998, I'm not talking yesterday. So a couple of years ago, I was asked to give a talk at an event that they have on campus. It's called Day on Campus. And the public comes in and they tour the campus and they have lunch. And it's a really warm, fuzzy, feely, good kind of deal. But they asked me to give a little talk on what happens to the children that come into the campus and why are they there, and what are the effects of trauma. So I'm standing outside before the room is full of people, standing outside waiting to go in to do this little talk. And this young lady came up to me and she was holding a toddler in her hands. And I could see that she was also pregnant. And she started talking to me like she had seen me yesterday. And I stood there trying to figure out who I was talking to. And so I was trying to make, you make this nonsensical talk because you don't know who you're talking to. And I said, "Oh, isn't she cute? How old is she?" And finally, she laughed. And when she laughed, I remembered who she was. She was a kid that I worked with in probably the year 2000. She was 15 at the time and had come in with a sibling group, had had a horrible, horrible background. And I really, sometimes you work with kids and they go off on their way and you don't know what happened to them. That was one of those kids that came into the residential. She went on her way. I didn't know what happened to her, but she turned around and said to her husband, "She's my therapist." And I thought, oh my God, she still thinks I'm her therapist. But she said to him, yeah, she was my therapist when I was here. And I really liked her. And I realized that maybe I did give her something. It's one of those times that you find something out that you didn't know. So, but I thought, well, here you are, you're married, you've got a child, you're going to have another child. You seem reasonably okay. And she really, I think, expected that I would know who she was. And I am so grateful to the part of my brain that clicked in that said, this is who this kid is, so that I could then kind of respond to her the way she needed me to respond to her. But everybody has a someone. So anyway, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. All right, I have a couple of videos in here that I want you to watch. This one's about 10 minutes long. Karen Purvis is in this video. For those of you who know who Karen Purvis was, she was a Texas psychologist. She developed trauma-based relationships. What is it? TBRI? Trauma-based relationships. I always forget the last. What's the last? What's the I? I can't remember. It's trauma-based relationship something. She's going to tell us. But Karen Purvis really started a lot of the work of helping us to understand that kids who have had trauma have got really have had underdeveloped areas of their brain. And Karen Purvis died a few years ago. She at a fairly young age. She was a great loss to the psychological community.
The brain is a wondrous machine.
Hold on, I need to turn that up or you're not going to hear it. Oh, yes, I do need to turn that up. Sorry.
Human brain is a wondrous machine. Literally from birth, our brains are exploring, reacting, and mirroring the world around us. A mother's loving eyes, a soft caress, a gentle, comforting voice. With every interaction, every experience, our brain creates connections. Respected researchers say our brains are sculpted by our early experiences. When those experiences are positive, in nurturing and responsive relationships, we flourish. But when early experiences are stressful, fearful, or traumatic, things can go terribly wrong.
Trauma harms the brain. This is not a software issue. This is a hardware issue.
In this video, we hope to deepen your understanding of how fear and stress and various types of trauma undermine the structure, the wiring, and the chemistry of a child's brain, putting the child at risk for a lifetime of social, learning, and behavioral problems. This is good information for anyone who cares for a child with a history of trauma, but it's crucial for parents of adopted and foster children, the vast majority of whom have suffered some kind of early harm. We'll help you understand how altered brain development can trigger what looks like bad behavior. You'll learn there's a big difference between won't and can't behaviors in fragile children whose brains were formed under stress and fear.
We understand that these behaviors are so perplexing and confusing and sometimes even maddening, but there's great hope. And we're here to explain to you what science knows about how to change the chemistry of fear in your child to a chemistry of hope and healing.
Just as trauma harms the brain, research shows positive experiences in trusting relationships can heal the brain.
Is there any chance I could trade you a hug?
That concept is at the core of a unique holistic intervention
And I wondered if we could.
created by Dr. Karen Purvis and her colleague, Dr. David Cross, at the TCU Institute of Child Development. A developmental psychologist and best-selling author, Dr. Purvis is an internationally recognized leader in the field of post-adoption care, who has devoted her life to helping children with histories of trauma.
You have a lot of things that hurt, don't you?
She calls them children from hard places. Based on more than a decade of research, Drs. Purvis and Cross have developed a program called TBRI, or Trust-based Relational Intervention. It's about empowering parents and caregivers to help children overcome the impact of trauma.
How are you feeling?
And reach their full potential. It all starts with building trust.
The phenomenal thing about a trust-based intervention is,
What would you like?
as we connect to this child, as we build safety, as we let them know they're precious, we actually change the brain chemistry. We've documented this and published it in numerous journals. not only chemistry, we change the wiring of brain. We change the development of the brain. For that child whose history took him far off course, we know how to bring them back.
As recently as the 1980s, scientists believed a child's brain at birth was fairly static, largely predetermined by genetics. Researchers now know that's not true. While genetics clearly play a role, scientists know that relationships and experiences shape the brain. Think of a developing brain like a multi-storied house under construction. In this chapter, we'll explore the basics of brain development and help you understand how early traumatic experiences can design a different house. When we're born, our brains are teeming with more than 100 billion neurons or brain cells. Under optimal conditions, when our needs are met consistently by nurturing caregivers, our brains thrive. These neurons connect in complex and vast networks, much like the electrical wiring in a modern home.
The baby comes with all this wiring, but it's the human interaction, looking into the eyes, being held, hearing the song of my mother, feeling the strong shoulder of my daddy, that begin to make the brain develop in very, very important ways for all of the life skills that will come.
At birth, the lower floors, or the downstairs part of the brain, is firmly wired in place by genetics, allowing a child to breathe, eat, sleep, and hear. Survival functions are rooted here. Very few connections in the upper floors are formed. These more sophisticated parts of the brain govern higher functions: complex thought, reasoning, emotional processing, memory, speech, most importantly, the ability to regulate our behavior. It takes time and repeated experiences for this circuitry to develop and become hardwired in the brain. When a child experiences trauma, abuse, neglect, or other risk factors, it can skew the wiring of the brain, as well as the structure and the chemistry. The lower, more primitive survival part of the brain can overdevelop from reacting to fear, while the critical upper floors may underdevelop and suffer.
In the book that I wrote with Dan Siegel, The Whole Brain Child, we talk about an upstairs brain and a downstairs brain. For some kids,
Dr. Bryson is a psychotherapist at Pediatric and Adolescent Psychology Associates, Director of Parenting Education for the Mindsight Institute in California, and best-selling author along with Mindsight Executive Director, Dr. Dan Siegel.
the upstairs brain is the more sophisticated part of the brain. It's our cortex that takes a long, long time to develop. And it's the part of the brain that allows us to regulate our emotions and calm down our bodies, understand ourselves, understand other people, and really be able to make good choices and be flexible and adaptive. The downstairs brain is much more primitive. It's actually really well developed at birth, and it's the limbic area and the brainstem connected to the body. And that part of the brain is much more reactive, and its job is to kind of constantly be watching for how to keep us alive.
Dr. Bryson's research and studies in attachment science, child rearing theory, and interpersonal neurobiology have made her a sought-after expert contributor with appearances on Good Morning America, PBS, and Red Book magazine. She says trauma triggers the watchdog part of the lower brain, called the amygdala, to work overtime.
And its job is to constantly sort of scan the environment, to be paranoid a little bit, to be watching, is everything okay here? Am I okay? Am I safe? Is anyone out to get me? Can I relax? And that part of the brain is always appraising what's going on around us, reading faces, reading the environment.
You like bubblegum?
No.
When children feel threatened or overwhelmed with fear, they may fight, run away, or shut down. The brain kicks into survival response, which researchers called fight, flight, or freeze survival mode. If the brain stays in this state too long because of trauma, it reorganizes around survival at the expense of healthy development of other parts of the brain.
So for a child who's had repeated exposure to fearful experiences, whether those be sort of a trauma like a car accident or whether it's developmental or relational trauma, where the caregiver was frightening, or they were left for long periods of time to manage their own fear states. The downstairs brain has gotten a lot of practice being active. It's the repeated experiences that we have that actually activate growth and connection in the brain. So if a child has had a lot of experiences where their downstairs brain that was reactive and fearful, that part of the brain gets really well developed. Whereas then the upstairs brain that knows how to calm that fear and kind of do that self-soothing, like, oh, that was a scary noise, but I'm okay now. That part of the brain may not be as well developed in children who have had repeated fearful experiences.
Even though our brains can seem like computers hardwired into complicated networks, they are not machines. The brain is a living, growing organ. As Dr. Bryson explains, it has an enormous capacity for change.
One of the biggest fears that parents have is that they've already messed up, or that their child has sort of been wired in their brain in a way that is going to be terrible for the rest of their lives. But what's really exciting, and what we know from the studies on neuroplasticity, is that the brain is so open to change. And what's so great about that is that when we have different experiences, the brain changes in response to those experiences.
Remember, repeated experiences shape the brain. The brains of children from hard places were formed by stress and fear, from unmet needs and harmful experiences.
Can you remember, use your big voice if you need me, right? Can you jump? There you go. And I'll come right away, okay?
You have the opportunity to reshape your child's brain
You're welcome.
through nurturing repeated positive experiences, the basis of attachment.
So that was the word that I couldn't remember was intervention. It's trauma-based relational intervention. There are a lot of group homes that use that model because by the time kids get into group homes, usually they're a little bit older, and usually they've had a lot more damage around the ability to trust. But what I really want you to get out of that video, besides the fact that Karen Purvis really was taken from us way too soon, is that our work can rewire the brain. The work that we do with our kids, the work that we help our foster and adoptive parents to do with our kids can really rewire the brain. And which is why somebody walks up to me 20 years later and says, oh, you were my counselor. I remember you. This was such a great experience for me. And I'm struggling to remember who she is. So, but the brain under stress, when we say what really happens to the baby brain, I think Tina Bryson Payson is a psychologist, and she works with Dr. Dan Siegel, who's another neuropsychologist, and we have done their trainings here. We've done no drama discipline. We've done the whole brain child. We've done quite a few of the things that they have done, but they really do talk about this whole model. And we always show this model when we're doing this training, because when she's talking about the amygdala is the part of your brain that stores all of your fears, your precognitive fears, your cognitive fears, all get kind of stuck in there. And if you know anybody that does EMDR, very simply put, what EMDR does is unlock memories that are in this part of your brain that you can't access to get them up here so that they're now cognitive and you can access them and you can say, okay, that was then, this is now. That was a scary thing that happened to me, but it's in the past. It's not hurting me right now. But most of what we see with our kids, what Tina was talking about, is that our kids get stuck in this pre-fear state. And this is the part of the brain, the cognitive part of your brain is the last part of your brain to develop. And it gets very little practice in development with children that have gone through extensive trauma states. Which is, just as an aside, if you are an adoptive parent or a foster parent, or you're working with kids and you say, you know, this kid could be a straight A student, why doesn't this child apply himself? Usually it's because this part of the brain has just not had a lot of chance to develop. And what do we say to our adoptive parents? Our adoptive parents always want the best for their kids. And the best in many of their minds is doing really good work in school and coming into their home and becoming straight A students. And we always try to say to them, give it time, because they really need time to let this part of their brain develop. This part of their brain has not had a lot of work. So when we're talking about chronic trauma, we're talking about the ability of the brain to develop normally. But think about this for a little bit. What do we do in the first 3 years of life? The first 3 years of life have jobs. A baby comes into this world with some jobs to do, and they're all the same job. I mean, every baby that is born comes in with the tasks in front of them of what do they have to do in the first 3 years of life. Well, the first thing they have to do is learn how to experience emotions and learn how to regulate those emotions. Most of our children, including the little guy that was here yesterday, haven't had a lot of experience regulating emotions because nobody's taught them how to regulate emotions. And how do we learn how to regulate our emotions? When we're babies, if we cry, we hope somebody's going to come and change our diaper or feed us or make us feel better again. So we have a wet diaper, it's uncomfortable, we cry, somebody comes, they change the diaper, and now we feel better again. So then we stop crying. If you have terribly neglectful parents, if you have opioid parents, if you have parents that are not there, you're not getting that regulation of emotion. You're not learning that very basic step to regulating your emotion. What's the second thing they have to do? They have to learn how to trust. A baby has to learn how to trust and form relationships with people. We didn't used to think that babies there was a school of thought many years ago, and this probably goes back to the Dr. Spock era, which is before all of your times, that babies, number one, couldn't see for a few weeks after they were born, that babies did not really recognize people. But we now know that most children will recognize the difference between mom and dad's voice by the time they're 6 weeks old. They may not know this is mom, this is dad, but they know that if I hear this voice is probably going to take care of me. I don't think that I have the video in this training, maybe I do, but there was a training out of Scotland. The Scots, for whatever reason, seem to get into a lot of these neurological studies that talks about how babies develop attachment, and that for maybe the first 6 weeks or so, they will pretty much attach to anything that's being kind to them. And after that point, they begin to differentiate mom's voice, dad's voice. Maybe if dad is a scary, toxic person, maybe that baby will recoil from dad's voice. If they hear grandma's voice and they know that grandma will come in and change the diaper or give me the bottle, then they form a connection to that person's voice. A lot of what babies are forming relationships with is their sensory hearing. It's the fact that they can hear, they can see you. But think about if you have babies or if you've had babies, when you bring your baby home from the hospital, and I don't think you can see it because the camera's kind of low, but you're holding your baby in your arms. And at that point, with most newborns, what they can see is from your arm to your eyes. They begin to develop more sight and hearing as time goes on. But the very early connections that you have with your baby is holding your baby and having your baby see you. So we have to learn how to regulate emotions. We have to learn how to form close relationships with people. And we have to learn how to explore the environment. For those of you who are, what is that circle of security? For those of you who are familiar with the circle of security intervention, It costs a lot of money to go to a circle of security training. And basically, what is the circle of security? It means that your child knows that you can go away and come back, and I'll be waiting for you. I want you to get out there. I want you to try to explore the environment. I want you to try to learn different things. Um, and when do we kind of see that? We see that when kids go to daycare. When we or mother's morning out or whatever they're calling it these days, pre-K, that's when kids learn how to explore the environment. And the kids who have not been able to accomplish that task are really the kids that have the most trouble going into a daycare environment, because all of a sudden, whatever their secure bond is, be it their foster parent or their adoptive parent or whatever, that secure bond is gone, and they haven't learned how to get out into the world and explore. And those are the kids that we get the calls from the daycare center saying this kid is hitting another kid, or this kid won't take naps, and most of it is just anxiety. So these are your tasks. These are your baby's tasks. They have to regulate their emotions. They have to learn how to trust you, and they have to learn that they can go away from you and come back, and you'll still be there. If you look at the first one, if you never learn how to regulate or modulate your emotions, and now you've had 4 or 5 foster placements, you've been removed from your parents a couple of times, you now go into an adoptive placement, what do you look like? What do all of our kids look like? And what medication are 95% of our kids on for that situation?
ADHD.
Yeah. Sorry, Christy, you caught me with a mouthful of ice. I can always count on Christy. Most of our kids come into foster care looking like they have ADHD. It's the first thing we assess them for. It's the first thing we medicate them for. If you have any job if you work at all in a group home, all of the kids in group homes are on some kind of medication to regulate their emotions. Do they really have ADHD? There was a psychiatrist who's now retired at Florida United Methodist for many years. He was older, so he remembered other times. And he said, I don't give them this medication because I think they really have ADHD. I give them this medication because I don't know how else to get them to calm down so that they can benefit by the interventions that the staff are trying to help them with, because they just haven't learned how to do it themselves. These are also the kids that are the headbangers. They're the rockers. They're the kids that get to be teenagers and medicate with substances, whether they get into drugs, whether they get into drinking or whatever. With most of these kids, it's an attempt to self-regulate because they haven't learned how to do it. So if we're talking about helping children learn how to regulate emotions, I always tell the story, and poor Carol has to listen to my stories all the time because she comes over the years. Carol and I have worked together for a lot of years. So she comes to all my trainings, and the price she pays is listening to the same stories over and over again. But when we talk about the good enough mother, you do not have to be there. If you're a mother or an adoptive mother or a foster mother, you don't have to be there for every single thing that these kids do. You don't have to fix every single thing that happens to them. You have to be what we call the good enough mother. And the good enough mother does enough self-regulation and enough guidance and then leaves the kid alone to try to figure it out themselves. If you never have to figure it out yourself, you're never going to learn it. And I always tell the story of being in a restaurant, and there were 2 very young mothers. It was with a luncheon. They were obviously out to lunch, and they had 2 little tiny babies in car seats that were on the table. They were young enough to sleep through the whole lunch, but one of the ladies had a 2-year-old, and the 2-year-old was in a high chair. And I mean, remember when you were, if you can, a young mother, and you just wanted some conversation with an adult that didn't involve spit up and trying to take care of a constantly needy baby. These two young ladies were trying to have a glass of wine together. They were trying to have some adult conversation, but the 2-year-old wasn't having it. So the 2-year-old was fussing with his mother, and his mother had the car keys, and she put the car keys on the tray of the high chair. And then she went back to her friend, and he played with them for a while, and then he threw them on the ground. So she leaned over, she picked them up, she put them on back on the tray, turned back to her friend. The same thing happened. He threw them on the ground. So I was watching it because I just thought it was interesting, but she became the good enough mother. And at one point, she finally picked him up. She put the keys on the high chair, and she looked at him and said, "You need to play now." And then she turned around. And the fourth time that he threw the keys on the ground, she did not pick them up, and she didn't turn back around. And she began to converse with her friend. And the baby finally said, "The jig is up. I've played this game enough," and kind of entertained himself and left her alone. So the good enough mother is going to be good enough. And you can say the good enough mother, the good enough father, the good enough caretaker to let kids regulate their own emotions, because otherwise they'll never learn how to do it. There's a very famous child psychologist. I believe he has now passed away. His name was TBRI. He used to write for McCall's magazine, and he was in his 90s when he passed away. But he was really a forerunner in saying you need to let babies learn how to do things for themselves. Take care of them, let them trust you, but let them learn how to take care of themselves. And he told a story that I heard on NPR one day. They were interviewing him. At that point, he was probably in his late 80s, and he was talking about his own children. And he said, we rocked them, we hugged them, we regulated them, and then they got to be about 8 or 9 months old, and we would put each one of them in their crib and say, "You can do this. You can put yourself to sleep. I'm going to leave you alone. You're going to fuss a little bit. You're going to cry a little bit, but you're going to learn how to take care of yourself." And that's the concept of the good enough caretaker. Now, what happens with our kids? They don't usually have anybody to teach them self-regulation, which is why they act the way they do, why they are not able to figure out how to calm down, why we all have them on Concerta and Vyvanse and whatever the ADHD drug of the day is. Second big thing kids have to do is learn how to trust caregivers. And if you think about the kids that you're working with, and my mind just keeps going back to this little boy that was here yesterday, who has had such inconsistent caretaking in the first 3 years of his life and such neglectful caretaking. And as I was reading through his CBHA, and looking at this little kid in front of me yesterday, who's now well dressed, well nurtured, well nourished, looking pretty good, actually, considering what he's had to deal with. And reading the conditions in which he lived for the first couple of years of his life. He came to these adoptive parents with no trust. They intuitively taught him how to trust them. They were good stewards of adoption training. And they hadn't had any. And that's what I said to him. You did it intuitively. But this little boy had learned to expect that they will take care of him. Most of our kids do not come in with any kind of consistency. They don't think anybody's going to take care of them. So when we go out as therapists and think about with my therapists that are on this call, when you go out and you meet your client for the first time, almost always you're going to be assessing, do they feel safe? And it's a simple concept, but if they've been removed, if they've been pulled out of their home, if they have been had inconsistent or pathogenic caretaking, they are not going to trust you or anybody else. And our job is to help them feel safe. So it isn't rocket science. It doesn't have to be super complicated. With a lot of our little kids, a lot of the things that we do with them is things to help them feel safe. what do you do with a little kid that's afraid to go to bed at night? Or is afraid to go into the bathroom by himself, or is afraid to have the foster mom turn the light off? Our maybe our focus is to say, how are we going to figure this out? What would help you go to sleep? What kind of a book can I read for you? What kind of a comfort animal can we give to you? What would you like foster mom to do? Would you like her to check the closet and make sure there's nobody in there? It's not complicated. It's just helping kids trust their caretakers and helping kids feel safe. Keep my eye on the time so I can give you guys a break when you need it. I think what we really, really see and what we want to see with our kids is that ability to develop interaction and to develop reciprocity with their caregivers, to be able to look at a caregiver and to know that that caregiver is going to help me. That caregiver is not going to leave me in a dirty diaper. That caregiver is not going to leave me hungry. Because when you have a lot of kids that we now have coming into care, what happens if you are with a terribly neglectful parent and you're crying because you're hungry, or you're crying because your diaper is dirty and you have terrible diaper rash? What's going to happen if you keep crying and nobody comes? What do these kids do? All of them. They stop crying. So we over the years, we have had a lot of kids that I would describe as failure to thrive. And failure to thrive is really not a concept that we hear a lot about. I think it was more a conceptualization that happened maybe 20 years ago, and I'm not sure why it's not conceptualized now. But we have a lot of kids that I would consider failure to thrive. And failure to thrive kids, not only do they stop looking for care. If you are completely neglected, you stop growing. You stop growing physically, you stop growing in your brain. And a lot of our kids just have not had that confidence to interact with people in the environment. And honestly, this is the thing that we see with all of them. They just have an impaired ability to interact. They don't trust you. They don't trust the foster parent. They don't trust the GAL that walks in the door. They don't know who you are. So they don't give you much. And that is so difficult with adoption work, because think about adoptive parents. They're wired. That these kids come into their home, they're wired to interact with these kids. They love these kids. They're ready to share with these kids. And then when they don't get anything back, it's difficult for them to understand that. The still face, I'm going to show you that video in a little bit. The still face really does, it's an exercise, it's a psychological exercise, and don't try it at home. But it really does, I'll show you in a minute, it really does show the impact of removing interaction from a child that's used to interaction. So our challenges for working with kids that have been maltreated in their infancy, we don't always get them in their infancy. We don't always get the CBHAs that tell what happened in the first couple of years of their life. And many, many times the kids can't remember what happened, because again, those trauma memories can stay stored in the mid part of your brain. There's a lot of kids that have had things happen to them. This little boy that was here yesterday, the dad said to me, he's not going to remember what happened. Well, he may not remember what happened, but the impact of what happened is going to stay stored. And that will be part of our work, is to help these very, very caring parents to understand what to do when those stored memories show up. We call them triggers. We call a lot of the things that happen with our kids are triggers, and they're triggers that kids don't understand. So that's one of the things that we talk about with when we do adoption work, is that you may not know what happened, and he or she may not know what happened, but it's in there, and you may have to deal with the triggers. So we have to kind of use the history to connect the dots. And that's why we always try to get the CBHAs for the kids that we're bringing into care. And I always urge the therapist, we'll put it in the kid's file, read it, because it's going to give you the history. It's going to tell you what happened. You're going to look for when was the child first removed? How many times was that child removed? How old were they when that happened? And then think about if they were removed at 2, what should they have been doing at 2 that they're now not doing? If a child is removed at 2 years old, by 2 years old, we expect a child to have been able to develop that interaction and that trusting relationship. And if that has not happened, now they're going on to the next stage of development and they haven't completed that task yet. And again, that's our job. So if you're looking at the CBHA, everybody knows, does everybody know what the CBHA is? Is there anybody that doesn't before I go on? I'll take that as a yes. When we are looking at the comprehensive assessment, or we're looking at the referral that we get and the information that we get, what are we looking at as red flags for that child's early history? And we see this in almost all of them. We're often looking for very young parents. And if you stay around long enough in the field, the children that you work with as children grow up and have children of their own. And those children grow up and have children of their own. And those patterns get repeated and repeated and repeated because I always say you can't give away what you didn't possess in the first place. And if you were never cared for as a child, and now you grow up and you have your own children, you have no roadmap for what you're supposed to do with these kids. And before I left Massachusetts in the late 90s, I had been working in the department. And so I had it was a small town too. So I had a lot of these youngsters on my caseload. And then I left and I developed a private practice and practically was across the street from DCF. And these kids who were kids when I had them are now teenagers and they are having their own kids and their own kids are being removed. And I really actually got to the point of a 3rd generation by the time I left. And it was so sadly apparent that you can't give away what you didn't possess to begin with. And if nobody has ever taught you how to take care of children, you don't know how to take care of children. So then that pattern just repeats and repeats and repeats. And that's the sad thing, I think, for those of us who have worked in this field for a long time, is that we do see that intergenerational stuff and think if somebody had just intervened with at some point along this family's path, could this have been changed? But we look for very young parents. We always look for that prenatal history of substance abuse. I would have to say at this point, there's very few kids that are coming into the foster care system that have not had some level of prenatal exposure to substance abuse. Now, some of it is worse than others, obviously. The absolute worst thing that you can do if you're pregnant is drink, because we can always try medically and neurologically to help you as a baby to wean off substances. Alcohol is brain damage and we can't. So, but we're looking for all of those prenatal histories of substance abuse. We're looking for that lack of prenatal care. When you are trying to interview, and you're never going to get straight information, especially if you're a DCF worker and you're trying to interview a mother and you say, when did you know you were pregnant, and were you drinking or were you using any kind of substances? And of course they always say no, nobody's going to say yes. So you have to kind of look past that and to say things like, well, did you have prenatal care? No, not until I was like 8 months along. Well, why would you not have prenatal care? For those of you who have gone through this, what happens when you go for your monthly checkup? What is the standard thing that happens when you go for your monthly checkup? What test is done?
Ultrasound?
Urine you're going to check, you're going to bring your urine in. Remember, young mothers, you had to come in with the urine, and you're going to check your urine for drugs. And a lot of these, for one thing, a lot of these mothers don't know they're pregnant and don't know they're pregnant to the point where they don't know that they should not be using, and many of them are addicted, so they're going to use anyway. And they don't have prenatal care because they don't want to come under the scrutiny of the doctor. They don't want to come under the scrutiny of the department. They don't want to have their urine tested for drugs. So we always look at those red flags. And certainly we're going to see separation in the first year. We're going to see parents that are absent, that are just weren't there because of drug abuse. We're going to see incarcerated parents. We see a lot of parents that are just missing, a lot of parents that are dead. And we certainly saw that if those of you who were working in this field, maybe 10 years ago, and we began to see the opioid crisis really, really heating up. And I'm kind of looking at Carol because I remember Carol having quite a few of these on her caseload on the West Coast, that parents were overdosing. They were overdosing accidentally, or they were overdosing on purpose. But we had a lot of very young children whose parents were dead, that we had to try to help in that situation. But we almost always see all of this with these kids. We see multiple caretakers. A lot of these kids have developmental delays, and that's the conversation that you want to have with an adoptive parent about what are the developmental delays that you're seeing in this child, and here's how we can fix them. And they are fixable. And that's the message of hope. You always have to give to people that this is a fixable problem. There's some things that aren't, and fetal alcohol is not, but it still can be dealt with. One of the trainings we're going to do later on in this year is the difference between autism spectrum disorder and fetal alcohol syndrome. And fetal alcohol is a lot more common than autism. But I know in this day and age, everyone seems to think that their children are on the spectrum in one way or another. But in all of the seminars that I've gone to on this recently, and Carol as well, that we do see that maybe 1 in 50 children are on the spectrum. 1 in 20 are affected by some form of fetal alcohol. And that's a trajectory that is harder to turn around. Speech delays. Why do all these kids have speech delays? They all have speech delays. I really couldn't understand most of what that little boy said yesterday when he was here, and he's been in speech therapy for a year. But why do these kids all come into care without the ability to articulate? How do you learn how to talk?
No one speaks to them.
Yeah, right. You got to talk to your kids. You don't talk to your kids, they don't learn how to talk. And I'm sure Elizabeth can tell us that because we've grown up with Elizabeth's little girl. So, but yeah, most of these, they're going to come in with developmental delays. They're going to come in with speech delays. And it's not that they are developmentally delayed. You have to have that caretaker to show you how to do these things. And if you don't, you're not going to do them. There was one point in time I was doing therapeutic visitation. I don't even remember which agency I was working for, but I always noticed the lack of conversation. When parents would come in to visit with their children, and they would come, but there was no conversation. I did a visitation with a mom, and she had 4 little boys, and she hadn't seen them for 9 months. And she came into the visitation center, and I always remembered it because I kept thinking, what is happening here? She brought them all Happy Meals. Okay, we started out good. She fed them. And then she took out a little tiny notebook, and she went to each one of them and said, what size shoe do you wear? Now, these are little kids. They didn't know what size shoe they wore. So she wrote that down. She put the notebook down, and she sat down. And for the next 2 hours, that was the end of the conversation. There was no interaction between this mom and these kids. And these kids were very used to taking care of themselves. So what we saw happening was that eventually they said, oh, the Happy Meal's over, and she wants to know about my shoe size, and she's just sitting there, and they just began to play with each other and began to just run around and do what siblings do and took care of themselves. And so I did what I always did. I would say, okay, now when the hand looks like this and this hand looks like this, mom's got to go. And I would give them like the 20-minute warning and the 10-minute warning. I didn't have to do that. She just got up and left, and she she had the Happy Meals and the shoe sizes, but she didn't expect anything else, and they didn't expect anything else of her. And they all had speech delays. When I say these are all significant events in the first 5 years of life, it's just what we just talked about. It's certainly, we see depression in young parents. We see lack of caregiving skills. I mean, what is this mother doing? She's writing something and she's propping the bottle. She's probably was fed that way herself and doesn't really know any other way to do it. I always add this picture because there's something that we do not take into account when we are talking about significant events of children's lives, and that is parents being deployed and being taken away from their very young children during the early years of life. There's a whole series on YouTube of reunions of fathers coming, and you mostly fathers, coming home from deployment and going into the daycare center and surprising their child, or going into the first grade and surprising their child. And it's supposed to be uplifting and happy. But if you watch any of these things, these children are so traumatized by the separation, and the reunion with the parent is so emotionally overwrought that I just wonder if the people that put this series up here and thinking that it's uplifting and wonderful realize that these children that are sobbing and crying and holding on to their caregiver realize how impactful that separation has been. I don't know that we have ever given a whole lot of attention to the needs of people in the military, but that's just another one. So when we say the maltreated child is going to be affected by early abuse, we always talk about pre-verbal children. This little boy that was here yesterday may not say, this is what happened when I was 2, and this is what happened when I was 3, but he knows it happened. He knows that something happened. We've certainly had a lot of young children. And I always remember one of my therapists, because I was in the car when she called me, and I was on my way to Tampa, I think, and she called and said, okay, well, I opened this little girl yesterday, and well, she's 2, so she's not going to remember anything. And I said, well, what did she tell you? And she said, this at 2, she said to the therapist, I can't remember what my mother's face looks like, but I can hear her voice. So where is that memory stuck? That memory is stuck in the amygdala. That memory is stuck someplace where she can't figure it out. She just knows that she can't remember. And we've had more than one kid say that to us, that I can't remember what she looks like, but I can remember what she sounded like, or I can remember what she smelled like, or I can remember something that happened, but that's all I can remember. Kids have little bits and pieces of memory in their implicit stored system, and the reason that it's hard for them to figure it out is that they can't access it and make sense of it. I put the hot sauce baby in here so I remember the story, but we had a very young baby that was physically maltreated by, I think it was a father. He was 2 months old when he was brought into the emergency room, and he had several broken bones. And he had a 4-year-old brother. The baby and the 4-year-old brother were placed with the grandmother. And our therapist was working with the 4-year-old child. So she went out to the house one day, and in the beginning, the baby was very resistant to the grandma. It was a boy, was pulling away from the grandma. And obviously, there was some pain there because of the broken bones, but did not respond to grandma's nurturing touch. Was pulling away, cried a lot. And eventually, because it was a very young baby and a very nurturing grandma, they worked through that. and the baby got to the point where the baby was interactive with grandma, the baby responded to grandma's nurturance. But the therapist got there one day, the baby was in the high chair, she was working with the 4-year-old, and the grandma leaned over the baby and she had hot sauce on her breath because she'd been eating a taco, and the baby started screaming, and she didn't know why the baby was screaming. Well, the 4-year-old said to the therapist, because dad used to put hot sauce on a diaper and stick it in the baby's mouth. So the baby was reacting to the pain from the hot sauce, from the smell of the hot sauce. And when the therapist called me about it, I said, you know what? That's a trigger memory. And that baby may always have that trigger memory. It doesn't mean that grandma can't learn how to deal with it. It doesn't mean that as the baby gets older and has some cognitive capability, that we can't say you're probably always going to react to that sound. You have a bad implicit memory from that smell. So if it happens, just know that you're safe, know that it's something that happened to you, and you're going to have to just learn how to deal with the trigger. But those are implicit memories, and kids that have been maltreated early are going to be affected by this. And I always say even a baby can experience grief, because we didn't used to think that babies had feelings, did we? We didn't used to think that that they would miss their siblings if they were separated from them. And having been in this field for a long time, one of the things about being in this field for as long as I have been is that you recognize that thinking changes, and the things that you were taught to do that you did in good faith may not have been the right things to do. And all you can do now is say that was then and that was a mistake, and this is how we need to do it now. But think about the Friday afternoon placements. If any of you have ever been foster care workers, the Friday afternoon placements, so you get a sibling group of 4, and you got to find a place for them, and it's 4 o'clock and it's Friday and you want to go home. So you're calling around, and you got a baby and 3 siblings. Who do you think is going to be the easiest for you to place? It's going to be that baby, because people like babies. And I can remember being a foster care worker and trying to make one of these Friday afternoon phone calls. And the woman said to me, I said, I have a baby. A baby's about 6 months old. She has 3 siblings. And she said, is she cute? I said, yeah, she's cute. Would it help you if I told you she was an ugly baby? Would you not take her? But people just like to take babies. Well, we thought the baby wouldn't care if the baby was separated from siblings. The baby did care. And I would see that repeatedly when we would bring them in for sibling visits. And there was one family in particular that I remember vividly, because the foster mother brought the baby in and the 3 siblings were already there. And the baby immediately reached out his arms to the oldest sibling who had been his caretaker, because he missed his siblings. Those were some of our early mistakes. I can tell you my early mistakes, and I didn't realize, I was a young woman. I didn't realize that the baby would miss siblings, but babies can experience grief. I'm going to do this and then I'm going to give you guys a break. We're going to watch a little video that, Carol, if you want to go do something for 7 minutes, you can, because Carol's seen this 1,000 times. Dr. Renee Spitz was a friend of Sigmund Freud, and he began to study the effects of babies that were left. If you know anything about World War II history, Europe was bad. Most of the countries in Europe were very badly damaged in World War II. I just watched a movie that was made in 2024 called The Blitz. And if you want to draw up a vein, watch that movie. It was the most gruesome movie. And it was about the Blitz in England, in London in 1940, when half of London was destroyed. And it wasn't just munitions factories, it was people's houses. And a lot of these babies were left in the rubble. They were left with no caretakers. And what that was kind of the beginning of that orphanage system, because there were so many babies that were left without parents. And they were warehoused in orphanages, and there was nobody to care for them because a lot of the adults had been killed. So caretaker to infant ratio was about 1 to 50, and they did not thrive. But Dr. Spitz decided he was going to study the effects of, he called it the effects, it was a study in maternal deprivation. It was done in 1952, and he wanted to know what happens to babies when they are left without care. And I will say that the good news, because I'm going to show you this video and it's pretty gruesome, his work led to the eventually the study that he did was the beginning of the end of warehousing children. Now, children are still warehoused in many countries in Europe. So if you are thinking of doing an international adoption, you need to be aware of that. But it was really the beginning of the foster care system. And it was the beginning, the results of his study just kind of said these children, not only did they not thrive, these kids stopped growing. So I'm going to show it to you. This video is 7 minutes long, and it was done. It's an old 35 millimeter reel, and it was done as part of a research study. So there is no sound. But what I want you to try to look at, if you've not seen these before, these are on YouTube. This is where I found a lot of his stuff, is that he talks about, not all of his conclusions are correct, but the basic conclusion is that these kids just stop growing. So I want you to just look at it. I want you to look at when it says how old these kids are, and then when they were placed there, and what they can and can't do. And after you watch this gruesome thing, I have a much more cheerful one to show you. So this was his basic premise when he started. So what I want you to notice with this kid are his eyes. She's going to poke this kid in the head with a pencil to see if she can get the child to react. Remember, this is a research study. They're not here to provide nurturance. Like I said, some of his findings didn't pan out, but the basic, his basic premise is that their growth stopped. So this kid is 9 months old, but this kid came into care at 3 months. And he still looks like he's 3 months old. And he can't roll over. and he can't self-regulate. You also notice that none of these cribs have any toys in them at all. These kids were never held, so they don't develop any muscle tone, which is why he can't roll over. And this is a 10-month-old that came in at 3 months, who still looks like he's 3 months. You also have to realize that there's somebody standing over these babies with a camera. And these babies are not reacting or reaching out or looking for any kind of attention from these people. And this baby's always looking at his hand like he can't quite figure out what his hand is for. You look at some of the other ones that are on YouTube that he did, these kids just don't move. They just lay in the crib. So basically, what he is saying in this study is that the mother, he's calling it the mother-child relationship, but a caretaker is essential to the growth of a child. If you don't have a caretaker to touch you, to feed you, to even help you to develop any kind of muscle tone, you do stop growing. And I have certainly seen that with kids that I've worked with, especially when I was working as a case manager. Kids that were not cared for, who had really neglectful parents, did stop growing. The little guy that was here yesterday was quite small. So what we saw, how are these kids affected? They all had low birth weight, but they all had very flat affects. They did not react to the cameraman. They didn't react to the people standing around them, and they didn't expect anything from those caretakers. Now, one of the things that I've learned in doing some more research on the Spitz studies is that a lot of these kids died. Probably 50% of the kids that were in those orphanages died before the age of 5. And if you look at the death records, which apparently I don't have much of a social life, so I'm looking at the death records of some of these kids, but they didn't die of diseases that one might think a child would die of. The death records would say so-and-so 3 years died from a cold, or had an ear infection or whatever. They just didn't thrive, and a lot of them did die at very young ages. So what we know and what I want you to take away from this is if you ever didn't think you were important to your children, you are incredibly important to your children. They may not agree with you all the time. You may not agree with them. You may have just had a terrible fight with your 14-year-old, but without your interaction in their lives, they would not be where they are today. So we've seen what happened. I mean, there's with Dr. Spitz, he had an interest in trying to determine what was going on with these kids. And he was the one who really tried to say, we've got to get them out of these orphanages and get them into some kind of foster care system. And if you look at things like the immigrants, with all this crazy stuff going on with the immigrants now, immigrants coming over into Ellis Island back at the turn of the century, the Irish, the Italians, a lot of those kids ended up in an orphanage on Ellis Island, and 50% of them died. And they died, about 50%, they died because they weren't cared for. So, and that's a whole other subject. All right, why don't we give you guys a 10-minute break? It's 10:30. Why don't you come back at 20 of 11? And I'm going to show you a much more positive video about mother-child interaction. And you can shake off all the nasty feelings you had from watching the Spitz video and go have a cup of coffee and come back in 10 minutes.
I can't hear you.
Sorry, I don't usually unmute myself. I was trying to make. Thank you for telling me that. Sometimes I forget to unmute myself and I go on for 10 minutes before finally somebody says, I can't hear you anymore. So, anybody have any comments or any questions that they have? Have you worked with kids like this? Is this making sense to you? I just like a little bit of feedback.
Barbara, I just wanted to mention, there's like a case study in the book, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog by Bruce Perry. It's called The Coldest Heart. There's a chapter called The Coldest Heart. I don't know if anyone's read it, but it's basically about a teenager who becomes a criminal, right? And he's serving in juvenile prison, but he has 2 parents raised by the same parent and has an older brother, but it talks about what happened, the difference between the 2 of them when they were infants. And it's very interesting because the older brother is living this successful life and the younger brother ends up being a criminal. So if anyone is interested in a case study, I can put it in the chat.
You know, I've never read that book. And I didn't know that Bruce Perry wrote it, because it's been around for a long time.
Yeah, it's like I mean, I don't want to say it's one of my favorites because it's one of the most disturbing books I've ever read, but it's really interesting.
Well, it's been around for a long time, and Bruce Perry really was one of the leading in the field of trauma-based work. So it probably reminds me that I need to read it, but thank you for that. Anybody else have anything that they want to say at this point? I just want to make sure that this is making sense to you guys, that you are seeing kids like this, or this is sounding like the kids that you have.
Well, if I can share a little bit on a personal level, my grandchildren are both adopted, and the youngest one, who is now 10, he had no idea of how to do anything. Whether it be showering, how to eat. Still at 7 years old, he was eating with his fingers, like he was still maybe about 6 months old, trying to get that figured out. And just in the short 2 years that he has been in our family, all of these things have really caught up. And so just that extra nurturing and understanding and patience really came a long way with this little boy. Not even being able to read, at 7 years old, having a preschool reading level, which is nothing in second grade. He's now up to like a seventh grade reading level, and he's in fifth grade.
And they grew too, didn't they? Both of
Mhm.
them?
Yeah, they've in the last 2 years, they've grown about almost 4 inches, both of them, and have filled out as well.
Yeah, Carol's grandchildren are a remarkable success story. And thank you for saying that, because I think sometimes we spend so much time with the ones that don't work out, or we don't see them working out, but you can really catch these kids up.
Mhm.
I also just wanted to mention, I don't see this often, but I have had one client who, with the neglect from parental substance abuse, has that like flat affect and, 12, almost 13 years old at this point, and really shows no emotion and shows no remorse. And I think that that's one of the biggest challenges when you're working with the adolescents who just have never developed empathy because they've never been taught it, right? If they're laying in their cribs crying and nobody's coming to them. And I just find that to be one of the most challenging cases, is working with kids that just have no empathy, and it's not their fault. It's just, how do you teach
Yeah.
it at this older age?
Yeah. Yeah, it's, Christy's right. I mean, because we do so much adoption work, and it's so hard to try to help adoptive parents to say, all right, this is how they came to you, but we can work on this, and we can really, really target these behaviors. I think that's what Carol's family has done with these two little kids. You've just, you know what you're looking for, and you know how to remediate it, and it works. But no, it is difficult with the teenagers. I know. And was thinking when I was watching Spitz for the 4,000th time, that so many of the kids that we have that end up like at the group home level, end up at like the Fumsch level or the Carlton Manor level, sadly, a lot of these kids are going to end up in prison, because they just have had no upbringing, no caretaking, no consistent anything. And when I talk about chaotic child welfare systems, I'm not blaming anybody, because I've been a part of it for 40 years, but it's so imperfect, and it doesn't nurture, it doesn't teach children that there are loving, caring adults out there. And a lot of these kids do end up on the wrong side of the law, and that's a sad trajectory that we're trying to avoid. So, and that's why we all double down on the adoption work and trying to say to these foster parent or these adopted parents, this kid isn't bad. This kid is just doesn't understand how to do the things you're asking him to do. And I was beginning to think, yesterday I thought, is there a full moon? Because we had all kinds of crazy things happen here yesterday. And actually the full moon was 2 days ago, but we had two situations here yesterday with adoptions. One with the little guy whose parents are really invested in trying to help him. The other with an older kid who's been in the adoptive home for many years, whose adoptive parents have reached that sad stage where they say, I just don't know if I want to have this kid anymore. So that's what we really try really hard to avoid. So, okay, let me get back to where we were. Okay, let's talk about what all happens when the right things don't happen to kids. When kids do not get what they need in the first 3 or 4 years of their life, they have lost that ability to develop normally. Now, that does not mean that you as a therapist, adoptive parent, GAL, foster parent, whatever, can't take this child and help this child catch up, because you absolutely can. But you need to recognize, like with Carol's grandchildren, that they need to catch up. And we know that the human brain is going to do 75 to 85% of its learning in the first 3 years of life. So if you think about that for a minute, what do you do in the first couple of years of your life? You know, when you're born, you watch that baby that kept rocking back and forth because he could not roll over. That's a normal developmental task of babyhood, is learning how to hold your head up and how to roll over, how to sit up, how to crawl, how to walk, how to talk. All of those things are physical things that you have to do in the first 3 years of your life. But that's like 75 to 85% of your life's learning that you do in that babyhood. So if you don't have that babyhood and you haven't learned how to do some of these things, can you learn them later? Yeah, you can, but you have to be taught. Karen Purvis said in one of the earlier video, that your brain, when you're born, has billions of connections. Well, you don't need all those billions of connections. So the first 3 years of your life, your brain prunes off the things that it doesn't need, and leaves you with the brain systems that you do need. And you have to have some adult in your life in order to develop normally, which is why those kids in the Spitz study, a lot of them didn't survive. Because in order to develop normally, you've got to have that reciprocity. You got to have that interaction. You've got to have that mommy sitting in front of the baby, clapping and clapping and clapping, because the baby has now done something miraculous, like look at a speck on the wall. But you have to have somebody in your life. And the good news is that most kids have somebody, even if it's a caretaker, a good medical foster mother, a loving grandparent, maybe an aunt, somebody that comes along that kind of tries to nurture that child. That's why we have foster parents. And I always put this is a cartoon from the New Yorker. It's the two wolves saying that kid we raised is tracking us, because most kids have someone in the first year. There's somebody in there. Maybe it's a nurse in the NICU. Maybe it's a foster mom or the volunteers who come in and try to nurture you and give the baby some skin time. But most kids have something. And that's important. It's important to recognize, if I can just digress for a minute about reactive attachment disorder, we have a lot of adoptive parents, let me get past this slide here, who come to us and say that their child has been diagnosed with reactive attachment disorder. We don't use that diagnosis at Circle of Friends. We don't use it for a couple of reasons. I've never liked that diagnosis, because it kind of implies that there's no hope here. And that's not what we want. We always want to instill hope in our caretakers. But if you really look in the DSM at the diagnosis of reactive attachment disorder, it's almost impossible to assign that diagnosis. There's just very few kids who meet that criteria because almost everybody has had something. So we always tell the therapist not to use it, and we always have the therapist come back and say, but the adoptive mother said it's in the kids file, because a lot of other people use it. Now, and I can't speak for the GALs because I can't speak for whether or not you've had this experience, but over the years, if an adoptive family comes to us and says, well, I just don't think that we're going to be able to work with this child because the other therapist said that he had reactive attachment, and you say, what does that mean to you? Reactive attachment for most lay people seems to indicate that there's no hope here, and there's always hope. So that's partly why we don't use it. So look at the first year of life. It is a critical period because when you're born, your brain is wired to attach. All those systems are there. They're all in your little brain. They're ready to be developed, but they're there. So those systems of attachment, that's when Chrissy talks about the teenager that doesn't have any empathy. All of those systems are in your brain when you're born for the development of empathy and conscience development and things like kindness or trying to understand other people. Those are all in there. We're all born with those things. To say to an adoptive parent, your child is never going to be able to develop empathy. Your child is never going to develop a conscience. Does our profession a great disservice. You cannot say that to people because it's not true. We understand that the concept that you are worthy of love is important to your neurological development. Any of these things can be worked on. One of the times that I was doing a training at Florida United Methodist Children's Home, I did it probably for 4 years. I went over there every Wednesday and I worked with the child care workers who were wonderful. But at one point, I said, I had this big room with all these people. And I said, does anybody have a failed adoption in your cottage? And everybody put their hand up. And I said, why do you think these adoptions failed? And I always remember one child care worker, he's still there actually. He said to me, the adoptions failed because the kids didn't say thank you. And he was very simplistic, but he was right. I mean, the reason that they failed was that these are kids who came in to the adoption system later in their childhood. They had not had any of this development of character traits because nobody had taught them anything. And so no, they didn't say thank you. They didn't say thank you for the Barbie bedroom. They didn't say thank you for the trip to Disney. They didn't say thank you for the things that adoptive parents thought they should be being thanked for. And that is the beginning of us trying to put adoptions back together to say, you know, they didn't say thank you, not because they didn't like it. They didn't say thank you because they don't understand reciprocity. They don't understand that they're supposed to give you something and you give something and they give something. Kids don't have that. It isn't even just as Carol said with her grandson who didn't know how to do anything. Not only do they not know how to be empathetic, not only do they not know right from wrong, they don't know what broccoli is, they don't know how to brush their teeth, they don't know how to wash their hair. Somebody's got to teach you that stuff. And with a lot of our kids, they're ready to learn all that stuff in the first couple years of their life, and then there's nobody there to teach them. So if you don't remember anything else from this training, you have to remember that the name of the game is catch up. And you're trying to help these people catch up with what these kids have not gotten. One of the odd things that we've kind of come upon in the last couple of years with some things that have happened in group homes is that the very simplistic thing, it just came up yesterday in a conversation, is one of the things that we teach our children when they get to be, whatever year you decide, 1 year, 2 years, that you're going to potty train them and you're going to teach them how to take care of their bodily functions. And that is important for their physical health. It's important for their psychological health. It's important for you as a mother to not have to change their diaper all the time. So you want them to be toilet trained. And yet we have had children coming into group care, 10, 11, 12 years old, that the child care staff would say to me, but they were leaving feces outside the door, or they were storing their feces in plastic bags and hiding it in closets. Well, that sounds like very odd behavior. But if nobody's ever taught you what to do about this stuff, you have to kind of figure it out on your own. If you don't have a good adult in your life saying, no, honey, this is how you take care of yourself, you're going to figure it out on your own. And in all the years that I have worked in this field, it is one of those things that suddenly hit me that I said, no, they're not trying to be nasty. They don't know what to do with it. So I think we just cannot underestimate how important we are to the care and development of our children until you look at kids who haven't had any care and development. All right, the still face I'm going to show you just because it's a lot more positive than the spit study, and I want you to recognize that we are very important to our children. But this is all over YouTube. If you haven't seen it, it's all over YouTube. And it's an experiment that in this particular case was being done at Harvard, but it's an experiment in which we kind of try to test the attachment of children with babies with their mothers. And it's quite interesting. So I'm just going to show it to you, and then we're going to talk a little bit about it.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 34 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby, who's about a year of age. And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her. This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this. And then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. Yeah. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, come on, why aren't we doing this? Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it. They actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, wait. It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
I always like to show this still face because that is probably one of the most famous ones, because that's the one we see the most on YouTube. And it's probably 10 years old. I'm guessing that Becky is probably a teenager now, but she was about a year old. And that's around the time at that 12, 14 month age range when they're really very interactive with their caretakers. And if you really watch the face of that mother, I don't think she could have held that still face any more longer than she did. But and it's always interesting at how quickly the baby comes back after she's used to getting interaction with the mother. So it's very interesting how quickly she comes back and says, this is what I'm used to. You know, I'm pointing, you're looking, I'm screeching, you're smiling. Kids that don't have that interaction, and like I said, don't try this at home, but kids that just don't have that expectation for interaction don't react like this. This is a very securely attached baby. She's very securely attached to her mother. And it's very obvious that she interacts with her mother and that they're kind of like in sync with each other. So when mom goes out of sync, then the baby reacts to it very, very quickly. I showed this back when we used to do trainings in person. Remember those days? I showed this to a whole room full of therapists and childcare workers, and and they all began to, because we were just talking about this the other day. It was just kind of funny because they were all women, and they all began to say, well, I don't know that my baby would react like that. Maybe I am not attached to my baby. Well, my baby had to go into the hospital when he was 2 months old. Maybe I'm not attached to my baby. By the time we got done with this discussion, I had this whole room full of people who thought that their children were not attached to them. And we had to do a group intervention to turn that around. But anyway, Google that on YouTube. There's quite a few of them, but that one is really the best. So to go back to reactive attachment again, all of our kids have disordered attachment. That's not the same thing as reactive attachment. And we really try to say this to adoptive parents when we're trying to work with them. If you've had kids who have had very interrupted bonding experiences, you're going to have to work to restore those bonding experiences. And it can be something very simple, like reading them a book every night that you tell them you're going to read, or make cookies when you say you're going to read it. But what we find with kids that have had interruptions is that they are somewhat delayed. Until we can get in there and work with them, they're somewhat delayed in terms of, you might have a 5-year-old that is acting like a 3-year-old. You might have a 10-year-old that's acting like a 6-year-old, but you can restore it. You as the adoptive parents, you as the therapist helping them, can restore it. And kind of going back to what Christy was saying before, these are all the things that can happen if you don't have a consistent caretaker. Conscience development doesn't, you're born with the wiring to have a conscience, but you have to learn how to use it. And what we see with a lot of these kids is that they haven't learned how to use it yet. They haven't learned how to be empathetic when they've been so badly hurt themselves. So the other thing that we absolutely, and you don't think about this, we see that these kids cannot think logically, and they don't always analyze danger, which is why they do kind of dumb things. And they're always kind of scanning the environment for danger. So, but they don't know how to analyze danger. They see danger. You can have an adoptive child who is in a loving home, but goes into the classroom and the teacher is trying to calm the class down, and the teacher's yelling at the kid saying, I need you to calm down now. I need you to be quiet. Everybody be quiet. And that one kid can look at that teacher and say, that's danger. That person's going to hurt me. Because their ability to be logical about who can hurt them and who can't hurt them is just not there yet. They don't have the ability to self-soothe. They certainly don't have any tolerance for stress. When I was a worker at Florida United Methodist, I had a couple of cottages of kids. I had 8 girls that were in the 13 to 15-year-old range, and I had 8 boys that were in that age range in different cottage. And I certainly saw this with all of these kids. These are kids that had come in, and it was before Medicaid, or before they were taking Medicaid. These were private placements. These were kids that just the Methodist minister had called the children's home and said, I've got this child, there's nobody to take care of him. And it was usually parents were incarcerated situation or parents were dead or whatever. But these kids came in and they were so difficult to deal with because they just had so little caretaking and they didn't know how to analyze danger. So they got into a lot of problematic situations, not the least of which was running away. Because, the whole adage of kids running away, if you run away, you're running to something. These kids weren't running to anything. They were just running away, and the whole goal was to catch up with them before they did anything dangerous. And sometimes they did. Sometimes they would run away, get into car with strangers. One girl that I don't think we ever got back, I mean, we're talking 20 years ago, probably ended up trafficked because the traffickers knew that these kids would run away and run out into a certain part of that field and they would be there. So these are just not kids that could figure out what was good for them and what wasn't. But the biggest loss of caretaker or lack of caretaker is really that inability to form attachments. And we begin to see impaired attachment by the age of 2, because if they get up to 2 years old and there's really been nobody there to meet the physical need, to meet the emotional need, it's really difficult to teach kids, yes, you can trust this person. This person isn't going away. And how does trauma affect the infant brain? It's going to, as we talked about, the trauma is going to print itself on the infant brain in implicit memory. And that is going to make your brain, you're just hardwired for trouble. Neurologically, what happens if you are frightened? Say you're walking down the street and you see a bus or a train coming or car or something coming towards you, you're going to jump out of the way. Your cortisol level is going to shoot up. You're going to say, this is danger. I've got to get out of the way. You're going to get out of the way. And then that cortisol is going to come back down again. That's your danger hormone. But what happens when kids are constantly traumatized? What happens is that their cortisol level goes up and then it comes down a little. It goes up again a little, it comes down a little. It never comes all the way down. So now you have a kid who is supercharged with cortisol, which is the danger hormone, and the kid can't calm down. The kid cannot scan the environment and say, this is not dangerous, but this is safe, this isn't. And it makes kids hypervigilant. And if there's one thing we see with our kids, is that they are hypervigilant. They're always looking around for danger. They're always trying to see what in the environment is going to hurt them. And even if it's just the geography teacher yelling at the class, they're going to see danger. And that is what makes kids trigger in school, is that, and I don't think teachers always understand this or see this. They don't see it coming, because let's face it, if you've got 25 fourth graders in front of you, you've got to get them under control if you're going to teach them anything. And sometimes the only way to get them under control is to raise your voice. And now you're raising your voice, and the other 25 kids are going to settle down, and you're going to be the one kid sitting in that classroom saying, oh my God, that teacher is trouble. That teacher's going to hurt me. Now, once you have done this, and once you become hypervigilant about your teacher, are you going to listen to anything she says? Are you going to hear anything that teacher is trying to teach you? No, you're not, which is why kids don't always do so well in school. So we have high levels of cortisol and we have decreased serotonin levels. Serotonin makes you feel good, doesn't it? When you have serotonin in your system, you feel good. If you are constantly exposed to danger, you have very low serotonin levels. When I say children of Iraq, I mean, I could put any third world country after that name now. Kids who have grown up, the kids that have been in the Gaza Strip for the last 14 months, the kids that are being raised in Israel, the kids that are in Iraq, the kids that are in these areas where there is constant danger, don't really know how to analyze that danger. And I have the picture, but I didn't put it up. I don't think I did. Let me go to the next slide. No, I didn't. I found a picture which was really very disturbing because it was a little boy on a swing and he was swinging. The swing was on a tree and he was swinging. And right next to him were a whole row of body bags that were about to be pushed into a mass grave. And he was completely oblivious to the fact that this was there. If you grow up in some of these war-torn countries, you can't analyze an appropriate level of danger. You just know that the world is always dangerous. So we know that trauma is going to affect the brain. We know that these kids are going to be hypervigilant. We know that they're going to not be able to self-regulate. The thing we don't think about, and the thing that adoptive parents don't think about, is that we absolutely know that if you grow up like this, and the first couple of years of your life are really fraught with trauma, you are going to get sick more because your immune system it will not develop the way it should develop if you're in a normal circumstance. And we know that from the ACE test. For any of you, I'm sure you're all familiar with the ACE test at this point. We know that if you grow up in terrible circumstances, you're going to grow up with a decreased immune system because your immune system is connected to all the other parts of your brain. And if the other parts of your brain are not developing, nor will your immune system. And that's why when you look at a lot of the biopsychs that we see on the kids that we do, and we get to the part about medical health, what are these kids all have asthma, they've all got allergies, a lot of them are obese, some of them are diabetic, you have kids that have chronic ear infections. And why is that? Is it because they're not healthy? It's because their immune system doesn't work the way it should. Now, what do we say to our adoptive parents when they want to take these kids in and they want to claim them and they want to put them on their Blue Cross? We always say, do not take your kids out of Sunshine Child Welfare because you can leave your kids in Sunshine Child Welfare. I forget what the cutoff is now. Is it 21 or 24? Does anybody know? What is it, 24? Thank you. You can leave your kids in Sunshine Child Welfare until they're 24. Leave them there because they're going to get sick more. They're going to need the mental health services that we offer them, but they are going to get sick more. And it doesn't mean that you can't help that immune system catch up. It doesn't mean that they can't get better, but we see an extraordinary amount of kids that come into care with health problems. And it's usually kind of those genetic things. It's usually those things like asthma that have maybe come down from 5 generations before. But our kids are susceptible to them. And I think you just heard Tina Bryson Payson, what is her name? Tina Bryson say this, that with kids with traumatized brains, they're always in this survival state. They're always just wondering if they're safe. And our job is to make them feel safe. And that can be something really, really simple, but that's our job. They're wondering if they're safe. They're wondering if they're cared for. But problem solving, that's the last thing on the brain of a lot of these kids. When we get in, we're going to get into a little bit about treatment options in a minute. But the reason that we do so much training with our therapists on those early interventions, those sensory interventions like play therapy or sand tray or bubble breathing or any of those things that have to do with sensory feeling good, is because our kids are really stuck in these stages. And they're not going to be able to sit down and have a little chat with you about what happened to them until they do feel safe, until they do feel connected.
Barbara, I wanted to just add to that with my grandson. I know one of the things, and this was probably a year and a half into him living with my daughter, is that at least 10, 15, 20 times a day, he had to pop out and see her where she was in a room and say, I love you. And he couldn't get through the day without doing that. And then the other thing was because she would sit and talk with him when he wanted to talk, that he has thanked her multiple times about being able to spend time and talk with him because nobody else ever listened.
Carol's grandchildren are really a wonderful success story because I've lived this path with her, and it's always so wonderful to hear when it actually does work. Because again, we spend so much time at the other part of the well that and we see a lot of adoptions fall apart, and that's discouraging for us in this field. So knowing that it can work, knowing that you can help make it work is really important. I did the adoption competency training for one of the lead agencies about 4 or 5 months ago. And it became, I mean, these people were not therapists. These people were working in the lead agency. They were placement people. They were people that worked in foster care. And I spent 5 days with these people, and it became very evident to me that they were so overwhelmed by the cases that they saw that didn't work, that they never had the well, we have the privilege of seeing them work. When you're in that, stuck in that child welfare world, the deep rock part of child welfare, you don't see it work. And it was really very obvious that these people really, really had a certain amount of PTSD from never ever seeing things work out, to the point where we ended up doing some kind of roundtable discussions with them because they needed some remediation too. They needed to know that things can work. So Carol's stories are kind of like balm to my ears because they did work. And we were at a training, where were we? At the SCC together when we were set up at the conference, and the kids worker came in and talked about how they were bigger, they were stronger, they were healthier, they had gained weight, they had gotten their marks up, they all the good things that had happened. So that was a wonderful interaction to have. So, and here we go. You've got to have a caretaker-child relationship. And what Carol isn't saying is that Carol and the grandparents are an equal part of the story of these kids, because you spend a lot of time with them, and you spend a lot of dedicated time trying to remediate a lot of this. And treatment has to take place within the caregiver-child relationship. That's why what we say to the adoptive parents is, I don't want to see your child in school. They always want us to see them in school. We don't want to see your child in school, because part of what we're trying to do here is to put your family together and build on those attachments. If we see them in school, we're missing that whole piece. And surprisingly, if you say that to adoptive parents, I think a lot of times they'll say, see them in school, because they just don't know what's going on. And they think, well, there's got to be something wrong with the child. It can't possibly be something wrong with me. Just kind of trying to explain, this is what we're trying to do, usually makes most of them come around. And this is what we say to the caregivers. What can you expect? You can expect your kid to look like your kid has ADHD. And you can expect your kid to be hypervigilant and to be looking around the environment for danger. You can expect a kid that has a trigger to something that you don't understand. A lot of times when we say kids seem to be daydreaming, I don't know if daydreaming is a good way to explain it, but I'm talking about the kid in geography that suddenly is afraid of the teacher and senses danger. That kid is going to retreat into his shell like a little turtle. And that kid will look like he's not paying attention. And then the next thing that happens is that the teacher says, Johnny, pay attention. You're not paying attention. And now she's yelling at him, and now it's getting worse. So sometimes just helping people understand that this is not abnormal stuff. Your kid is not going to see you as a caretaker. Your kid is not going to see you as a nurturer. Your child does not expect much from you. So we're going to work together, and that'll change. But right now, you've only had, say you had this child in your home for 2 months. It takes, if it took them 10 years to get this way, it's going to take them more than 2 months to get out of it. So you can certainly expect kids to not seem to have a conscience. That doesn't mean that they don't have one. It just means that they haven't been taught how to use it. And it can take a while. We always try to say to people, just take your time with this. I mean, how long have the kids been with you, Carol? 2 years?
Yeah, it'll be, yeah, it's about almost 3 years.
Barbara, I just want to, I literally just had a placement disrupt. And sometimes initially, and the child has only been there since like the weekend before Christmas, and this is pre-adoptive. But you know, you're going in kind of, I feel like a lot of times these families are not prepared at all. And this was like, it was pre-adoptive, right? So child moved from group home to this pre-adoptive. And, you know, I had only 2 sessions with them and told them like, you're going to see these behaviors, you know, and this might have happened yesterday. It's going to happen again. And you need to think about how you're reacting or whatever. But the communication I got is like, we're not equipped for this, right? And so they just decided to disrupt last night. And, you know, I wonder, when I first spoke with them, I said, you know, what was your training? Like, what was your preparation? And they say they go through this 10-week program or whatever, but I question, really, are they prepared for some of these behaviors that, you know, and this is before we're even in the picture.
Right.
And I
Right.
don't feel like a lot of these families are prepared at all.
Well, they're talking about, I don't know what they're calling it now. It used to be MAP, and then it was Pride, and it doesn't prepare them. They're not prepared. And that's when we talk about the adoption competency training, who adopts really? I mean, CEOs do not adopt. People that have everything that they need do not adopt. And people who adopt are nice, average, middle-class people who want to have a child, who have no idea what trauma does to a child. And I'm sorry that happened. I know it's terribly sad when that happens. It's terribly sad for the children. It's terribly sad for the adults, because often they really haven't been given the training that they need. I mean, you didn't have time. You had 2 sessions. And during Christmas, who places a child for adoption in the middle of the holidays? I mean, that's just too emotionally laden to have anything work at that stage. Um, and think about, how old was the child, Christy?
13.
Oh,
And, you know, that was the other thing is, when in the first session, I asked them, you know, why did you adopt, et cetera. And they mentioned that they originally had wanted, I guess, on whatever the application, a 2 to 7-year-old, and that they had met my client, you know, at one of these events or whatever. And it's just the case management team sort of knowing that they said 2 to 7, and then they're like, oh yeah, like encouraging sort of this other match. It just, to me, it could have been approached much differently and with a lot more preparation and background. So going into it, I was a little bit apprehensive, just kind of knowing what they had said and everything. But then for it to have been disrupted so quickly was definitely shocking.
Well, I don't even know where to start with that story, because number one, people that want children, you can't underestimate the time of year that this happened, because this is not a rent-a-kid for Christmas type of thing. And they probably, those matching events, we know those matching events are difficult. They're difficult for everybody. It's the best we have, but they're difficult. And you meet a kid and it's the holidays and you're emotional and you say, yeah, let's try this. But and you didn't have time to really get into what made you decide to do this, or what made you decide to disrupt. But there were probably so many errors of judgment along the way that it's hard to figure out. And it isn't important to place blame. It's just important to say this just didn't work out for the sake of these people. And you won't have any more contact with them because now the child is gone. But you'll never know the end of the story. You'll never know if they had any kind of preparation, if anybody explained to them what trauma does to a 13-year-old girl who, besides the fact that this kid is going through puberty, it's Christmas, whatever her background is, all kinds of stuff that could have gone wrong there. So that's tragic, really. And it probably happens more than we like to know. So what can we tell our caregivers to do? And this is the thing that I used to get into this with the childcare staff at FUMPS a lot. This is not rocket science. If you're trying to get your child to try to connect to you, just don't disappoint them. They've had a lot of disappointments. Don't be a part of that disappointment. If you say you're going to do something, do it. If you tell them that you're going to make cookies on Friday night, then make them. If you tell them that you're going to read them a book at 7 o'clock every night and they can pick out the book, then read the book. It's not hard stuff. I mean, we're there. You know, if you look on YouTube at our playlist that we put up there about for adoptive parents, we say that in all those little vignettes. Just do what you say you're going to do, because they've been disappointed. They don't expect caretaking from adults. They don't expect adults to do what they say they're going to do. So it's super important, if you are going to be the adult in this situation, that you say, okay, I told you I was going to do this, we're going to do it. And I always used to say that to the childcare staff, and they used to say, there's got to be more to it than that. There isn't. There really isn't. If you set up regular caretaking routines and then you keep them, that's really, really important.
The other thing too, Barbara, and this is experience of being a counselor with a lot of these families, is that, you know, some of the things families will not tolerate is children lying. And trying to get the caregivers or the pre-adoptive parents to understand they're not lying. They're just protecting themselves because they don't want to get in trouble. And it's the same with them saying they're hoarding food. There's been times where they had to go look for food. They had to go knock on neighbors' doors, you know, and find food. They've been hungry. They know what that feels like. So they're not hoarding, but trying to get the caregivers to understand those two things are not real in the real sense of the word for these children.
And that is so true. And that's kind of like with Christy's situation, when you have just a nice garden variety couple that have not experienced any of this stuff. You know, we're in this world. We live in this world of child abuse that most of the world does not. So most of the world is not expecting any of this stuff to happen, and probably thinks that we're making it up when we say that these things happen. We have to remember that the world we live in is not the world that most people live in. And we understand it, but our adoptive parents don't. So, and I always tell them, don't rush to give them ADHD meds. I realize that if you're in congregate care, sometimes we put all these kids on drugs to just sort of tamp them down, but you don't want to put them on ADHD meds if you don't have to. You'd be surprised, as with Carol's grandchildren, how some dedicated work can calm them down. Now, for those of you who are therapists, the best thing that you can do with these situations is to make your families believe that there is hope. What is it that Eric Gentry says when he does the 10 core competencies? You have to have a positive expectancy. You have to help your families understand that you think you can help them. And sometimes you have to fake it till you make it. Because sometimes you get these situations and you think, oh my God, I don't know what to do with this. But you can't ever let your families know that. You just have to try to say, I think we can work on this. I think that this is going to work out. And then if you can hold on to them long enough, and obviously Christy wasn't able to do this, you can start to educate people about what's happening with their kids. A lot of what we do is psychoeducation. These are what triggers are. This is why this is happening. This is why the thinking brain is shutting down. This is why these kids are under stress, because maybe they're hungry and maybe the adoptive mom is making dinner, but they don't know that because they've had enough situations where they had to go looking for food themselves. So we do a lot of psychoeducation, and that's a lot of the work that we do. And we have a different code now in Sunshine that we can use just for psychoeducation, and we need to use it because a lot of what we're trying to help our caregivers to understand is that they can make this, they can switch this around themselves, but they have to believe that they can. And that comes back to there's a baby in someone. They've got to be the someone, and we need to help them. And we try. I always leave this little slide in here, and I don't know why. But when I say what type of treatments work best, this is a Bruce Perry slide, actually. And this just shows the brain and the way the brain builds from the bottom up. But we don't even get to these abstract types of things that we do with kids until we calm them down. And that's why we do so much with yoga or music or drawing or any of the things that we think that the foster parent or the adoptive parent will say, well, all you did was play with him. Well, yeah, you did play with him because you wanted him to feel calmer. You wanted him to feel that he was safe. So we don't even get into these abstract kinds of things until we've worked with kids long enough to make them feel safe. And let's just talk a little bit about what we are doing with our kids, because I sent you guys the yearly calendar yesterday for what we're going to be doing for the rest of the year. And a lot of what we are doing is experiential. You always ask me after trainings, okay, well, I taught you about trauma, but now what do I do? We we aren't together the way we were before the pandemic. We aren't all in the same room together. What we used to do was a lot of hands-on stuff in our different training rooms. The last time that I actually had the East Coast people here all sitting around the table, which was probably 7 or 8 months ago, we were able to get them to actually come in here, and we did a whole group sand tray. We talked about sand tray. We brought the sand tray in. Everybody had different toys, and everybody built a group sand tray. And then they explained what they were doing and how they did it. It's a lot easier to do those experiential trainings when you're in the room, but that's not the world we're in right now. So we're doing the best we can do, but we are going to move into treatment modalities. We're going to talk about play therapy and how we use art and how we use sand tray. EMDR requires specific training, but I got to tell you, EMDR is not rocket science either. It's an intervention, and it's a very good intervention for certain kinds of trauma. And it is a very good intervention for just helping kids to remember things. But EMDR started out, for those of you who remember this, in 1996, Francine Shapiro developed EMDR. And for many, many years, we were told that we couldn't do it unless we went through this whole big, long rigmarole of a training. You can. It's an intervention. You can learn how to use it. You can also learn how to use just bilateral tapping. Bilateral tapping is something that kids like to do. It's fun. And it kind of unleashes a little bit of sensation of calmness in them. The emotional freedom technique, which makes you feel silly while you're doing it, but it's the one where you tap, tap, tap and say, I'm okay, tap, tap, tap on the acupuncture pressure points. Do we always understand these kind of Eastern culture types of things? We don't, but they work. Yoga works. The kids who like to do Goodnight Moon, we have that on our playlist on the YouTube channel. They enjoy Goodnight Moon. They enjoy, what's the other one? We've got 2 or 3 of them up there. The yoga pretzels. For a while, the therapists were buying yoga pretzels. It's a card pack on Amazon, and the kid could pick a yoga pretzel and then do that pose. Are they talking about what happened to them? Not necessarily, but they are connecting with you. They're connecting with their adoptive parent. They're beginning to feel safe. You're getting them to calm down. Of all of these things here, I cannot tell you what brain spotting is. I don't know why I leave it up there. I sat through 6 hours of it. I know no more about it after I sat through the 6 hours than I did before, but it's there. And clinical hypnosis, you do have to be certified in Florida to do clinical hypnosis. But any of the rest of these things, you can use any of these interventions. You do not have to be certified. You don't have to be level 4 sand tray certified. You don't have to be art therapy certified to use the intervention. You're not going to call yourself an certified art therapist. You're not going to call yourself a certified play therapist. You're just going to use the interventions. You're not going to hurt anything. Just get in there, try them, use them, use what you think is comfortable, and eventually you're going to fake it till you make it, and you're going to see that this is going to help these kids calm down. Now, why are we doing all these things? You know, when we talk about the sympathetic nervous system is the fight or flight. If your sympathetic nervous system is activated because your geography teacher is yelling at you and you're frightened about what that geography teacher is yelling about, your sympathetic nervous system or your feeling brain is going to pop up. And once your feeling brain pops up, you're not going to hear anything that she says. You're not going to understand anything that she says because your parasympathetic nervous system or your thinking brain is not activated. And that's why we say parasympathetic is fight or flight and parasympathetic is rest and digest. Your goal is to help these kids rest and digest. So your goal is to help everybody lower the temperature on their brains so that their thinking brain can come online. And just think about yourself in any situation where you are frightened or angry. I can certainly say that I have done this myself, or I might read, I have to say I probably just did this the other day. I read an email that came through from something, and when I read it, it certainly activated my sympathetic nervous system, and I got angry about it, and I looked at it, and I said, that is dumb. I don't know why anybody would do that. And I let it go for a little while, came back to it later and read it and said, my God, that didn't say that at all. Because by now I've calmed down and my thinking brain is back on, and I realized that what that email was not what I thought it was at all. So that can happen to anybody, and believe me, it happens to the kids. So once you've got your thinking brain back on, then you can start to do the stuff that we were trained to do 25 years ago. You can do TFCPT, you can do motivational interviewing, you can do DBT, you can do any of that stuff, but you can't do any of it until you've gotten kids to the point where they are calmer, where they are feeling safe. And again, that isn't rocket science either. Sometimes you might feel, and I said this to somebody that I'm doing licensure supervision with a month or so ago, every minute of your session does not have to be therapeutic gold, because it's not going to be. Every minute of your session has to be something intentional that you're doing, but it does not mean that every minute of your session, the child has to be sitting there telling you every single thing about his trauma. You might spend, and I used to say this when I had a private practice because I had a clock and I had to watch the clock. So I had like a 9 and a 10 and an 11, the way you do in private practice. And I would have kids come in. And so it's 9 o'clock. I would say I would wait till about 20 after. I spent the first 20 minutes just kind of getting everybody calmed down. Everybody's kind of feeling relaxed. Maybe we're doing a little drawing. Maybe we're doing a little clay work. And we're 20 minutes into it. And then I would start to introduce whatever the topic was for maybe 20 minutes. And then the last 20 minutes, you got to put that kid back together. So you can't send a child back to geography or back to math if that child is still activated and triggered. So you're not going to get 60 minutes of therapeutic gold. You might get 10 good minutes out of a session where a child is kind of calmed down, activated, able to share something with you, and then you got to put them back together and let them move on. It's just the nature of working with children. It's probably the nature of working with adults too, but adults at least have the cognitive ability to know that they've got to settle down because they got to go back out and get in the car and drive in traffic. What are the kind of treatments that we really try to use, I don't have anybody right now that is trained in child parent psychotherapy, CPP. CPP requires a training, an expensive training, and then you have to go through 6 months of post-training supervision. And you're only allowed to use CPP techniques. So I had one person who did it, who was so sold on CPP that every single note explained what it was. And she probably did good work, but it's kind of difficult to only use CPP. Parent-child interactive therapy is another one. It is a evidence-based treatment. It's probably a wonderful treatment. It's difficult to use. You have to be trained in it. There are certain things that we do not have in place that allow us to use it. But the last three you can use. Dyadic therapy is just parent, caretaker, and child. Dyadic means two. You can do, and these three are pretty much alike. Dyadic therapy, filial play therapy, family play therapy, all involve working with the caretaker and the child. And the goal is the same. You're always trying to make them feel safe within the context of the relationship. You're always trying to make them feel like they can then trust this adult. And you don't have to go through thousands of dollars worth of training to do it. And with a lot of the training that we're going to try to help with all of you new people learn how to do, we're not going to ask you to do anything that you're going to have to spend a lot of money on. We're going to teach you interventions that you can use, and you'll use them until you get good at them. You're not going to hurt anything. Trust me. Use the trainings, use the interventions until you feel comfortable and competent. And in the meantime, you won't have hurt anything. So, we have to always give this message that caregivers and therapists have got to recognize that there's an effect on brain development with kids, and we can fix it and it can repair. But if you don't do anything else, and I think Cheyenne was with me yesterday when I was trying to do this with her parent, which was to say, this can get better. You've already done a wonderful job with what you've done so far, and this can get better. And I think at one point he said something about the child was manipulative, and somebody made this comment, I don't know if it was Christy or Carol, that and I said, and why? And he said, I think he did it to protect himself. I said, you're right. All kids are manipulative for a reason, because kids don't have power in the relationship in the world, so they use what they have in front of them. And if you've been raised in these circumstances, you've learned how to shape the world as best you can. But it's just, you got to be patient. This is the end of this part of this presentation, and I am going to unshare the screen. And say once again, somebody asked a question here, hold on. At what age can one start dyadic filial or family play therapy? You know, with any of these things, we start our kids at, because we use infant mental health, so we start them sometimes at 2 or 3, as long as they're old enough to interact with their parent, because the whole goal is just to get them to start interacting and trusting. So, and those three are pretty similar, kind of similar in concept, but the whole goal is to help kids just learn that these people are there to help them and they can be trusted. So, well, any other comments that somebody would like to make? I thank Christy and Carol, because I can always count on Christy and Carol to share things with me. But what about the rest of you? GALs, talk to me. I always want you to have trainings, but I want to make sure that your trainings are something that are going to help you in your work.
Can I ask you a question? I'm a GAL, and I've only been a GAL for 1 year, but what I'm finding when I'm working with, I have 3 brothers. They have a therapist who's very good, and they have a psychiatrist, but the kids are being required to visit with the person who inflicts the most trauma, which is their mother. And this happens weekly. The foster mother's frustrated by it. They come back from the visit and we have a whole week of chaos. So I'm just wondering if you have any guidance about that.
The one thing I will say is, it's Michelle. I want to make sure I'm reading your name right.
Yes, it's Michelle.
We all go through this with court-ordered visitations. Sometimes there are times that you can try to explain to the judge how this may not be working. There are times that we have had the therapist try to go back and say, could we readjust this schedule? Because weekly is tough. You don't have time to remediate from weekly visitation. And it is difficult because we work in child welfare and we're all working within the parameters of what judges order. And judges' background is not our background. So they want these kids to see their parents. I think that judges make these decisions from a lack of knowledge sometimes. But trust me, we all go through these things where we think that this is going to be harmful. And I don't know if our therapists have any insights into this, but I know that we have gone back to the case manager and said, what can we do to fix this? What can we do to stop this? Now, if the case manager if you have a good relationship with the case manager can bring this to the attention of the court. Unfortunately, what you end up having is a lot of infighting, and the foster mother's mad at the case manager is mad at the foster mother. It's just, you get into a lot of infighting, which it sounds like you're experiencing.
Well,
So
if I can just add in there too, I think it really depends on what is the permanency plan for these children.
yeah,
Is the permanency plan for them to be reunified with their parent or parents? And if that is the case, we want to do the best that we can in order for that to happen. And that may not mean weekly visits. It may mean that it needs to be slowed down a little bit, for everybody to get on board and to have those communication skills and building trust again, because there's been a lot of trust broken. So it really, there's no really clear answer on that. It's just what's all going on and what is the goal, because parents should be raising their children.
Right.
That would be the ultimate end, to everything. But we have to do it in a way that the courts understand that their legality part doesn't match with our children's emotional needs.
yeah. Carol's absolutely right. Michelle, do you know what the permanent goal, what's the goal for this family?
Well, it's been reunification. It's a second removal, and their year's up in February, so, which is, right around the corner. So we're going to make a recommendation, but I'm struggling with a reunification goal right now.
And I don't know this case, but I do know, and we can certainly speak to this, that we get asked to do visitation, not so much because they want to reunify, but they want, what's the word I can use? They want ammunition to be able to say to the court, this isn't a good idea. These visits are not working, why they're not working. Now, that might be good ammunition, but it's also very difficult for the children and probably for the parent as well. And I wish Carol's right. I don't have any clear answer because we all have to struggle with this. And at the end of the day, I think we as therapists will try to say, maybe we should slow this down a little bit. Maybe we should try some individual therapy with these kids. And then maybe we can look at family therapy and bring the mom in. But visitation is unfiltered. It's not the same thing as a family therapy session. So sometimes we will back it up and say, could we try a family therapy session? Because there's a little bit more control if you're doing family therapy. But I don't know where the visitation is, but visitation can be pretty unfiltered.
I've dealt with actually several cases that are similar to what you're talking about. And one of the sort of philosophies that I have and talked to Carol about before is, the kids have no power at all in these situations. And this is where I think the gal does come in, is asking, what do the kids want, right? Do they want to see their parent? And I've had kids say no. I don't want to see my parent. And then maybe a week later, yes, I do. And I think that, you know, making the parent now have to sort of deal with this is how it is. You've created the situation, and let the child sort of guide the visitation, because they do, I find, sort of waver from not wanting to see their mom at all to wanting to see their mom. And that way they feel like they have some power in this whole mess. And then especially with teenagers, even the question, I get this a lot from case managers, you know, does the client want to see their parent? Even me asking the question to a teen gets them dysregulated. Just the question itself makes them upset and in session. And so in those situations, I've said, you know, let's put a pause on, you know, even kind of visitation right now. And, you know, usually a child might bring it up later on in sessions, like they want to see, but I think it's really important to give kids some sort of say and power. That's the way that I feel about it.
No, I agree. I don't think I'm supported by the case management team in that sense, but even if asking, can we just take a break, hasn't been very successful so far.
Well, and you know, again, one of the training, I think it's next month's training that we're doing with, I'm working within the child welfare system. One of the difficulties, you said you've been doing this for a year, is that kids in child welfare come with a whole team of people, and that team is not well oiled. They don't always work together very well. And we have a lot of situations where foster parents side with GALs, or they fight with GALs, or they fight with the case manager, or they side with the case manager. And that gets in the way, because we're just trying to say, what is the best option for this kid? And things like using visitation so that you can get ammunition to say this isn't working is a fine way to get ammunition, but it's very hard for the children that are going through it. So it's just what I say, it's a messy system, and it's not always a very efficient system. But well, all we're going to do for Michelle is tell her that misery loves company, and we're all kind of going through this at the same time.
Thank you so much.
Can I share this real quick, Hal? I mean, I did foster care here in Florida, and there's always a panel that the foster parent, guardian ad litem, and everybody attend once per month. And you do have an input. You can say your experience, and that was my experience with foster care here in Florida and even in Massachusetts. There is a monthly meeting, or whenever it's scheduled, that the foster parent get to speak what's going on with the child.
You're
And to
talking
say
about
what
team?
their recommendations are.
Myrna, are you talking about a multidisciplinary team?
I don't know what it's called, but it's a team that you attend. When the child is placed in your home, they have that meeting. And then after a couple of, I think, if you have concerns, they'll have another meeting. But again, whether the child is in your home for long term, or the child is going to be adopted out, but you do have that opportunity as a foster parent to go in and say what your experience is with the child and visitation with the mother.
You know, I'm wondering if some of that has kind of fallen apart a little bit, because
Yeah,
our child
could be.
welfare system is in a bit of disarray right now. And
Yeah,
Embrace
yeah.
Families has gone out of business, Family Partnership has taken over, because I know what Myrna's talking about. And I think we may have lost some of that structure
Okay.
as we came through the pandemic and people were working from home and all of that kind of thing. But I know what she's talking about, and it does give you that opportunity. But and you did have the opportunity to say what you thought or how you thought this should be handled. But we're not in a perfect system at all right now. We're in kind of influx in child welfare in Florida, and that's unfortunate, because we thought we had come a long way when we entered privatization 20 years ago, and we've kind of taken some steps back. So anybody else have anything that they would like to add? I really would like to hear from the GALs, because I invite you guys to come to these trainings, and then I'm never sure if I'm hitting the mark with you. Susan, I'm gonna call on you just because I can see you. Has this, I know you've come before, have these things been helpful for you?
Yes, certainly, Barbara, thank you. This presentation today was a good reminder of certain things, and we certainly do experience this with many of our children, and just kind of to step back to what Michelle brought up, that's one of my cases, and Michelle and I work closely together, and she's just an amazing volunteer. And unfortunately, the mother would appear to be the mother of the year. She is very keen in sending pictures to her attorney to have things status to the court showing that these visits are just wonderful. She brings food and shows pictures of happy children eating food, but then she'll say hurtful things to them. That, and the older child, his name is George, he as his therapist has said, and Michelle can speak better to all of this, he's just a shell of a child. He has been traumatized by horrible things that she's said and done. And it's the Guardian Ad Litem team has had multiple meetings. We have another one this Friday. We hit a stone wall when it comes to the department, unfortunately, because the case manager just doesn't do her job. Easy as that. But back to your question. Thank you. Yes, this training today has been helpful. I had put that question in about what age can you start with those different therapies, because I have one little boy in particular who is 18 months old that is just exhibiting the most dreadful behaviors. But he's been with a foster mom since he was 3 months old, and he is just the center of attention in their home, and she carries him constantly, and he is so attached to her that when he's somewhere else, he'll do all these things to get attention. And it's kind of the opposite effect of what you've talked about. A child that gets no attention, he gets so much that he can't survive without. So
she's not the good enough mother.
Oh. And sadly, her 3 biological children, every time I go to their home, I see they're distancing themselves more and more from this child and her, because they've kind of had it, because she's always doting on him. But, you know, what can you do?
If I could ask, who is doing this visitation? Is this a therapeutic visitation for these kids, or is this just a supervised visitation?
Michelle's children, that case, it's 1 hour of therapeutic visitation, and then she has up to 3 hours of unsupervised visits. And she's done things like take them to her home, but then told them, no, don't tell anybody. And then when that child tells someone, and Michelle has such a wonderful relationship with those kids that she calls them all the time, and they tell her about visits and things. But so they do have an hour of therapeutic visitation.
Well, it's we do therapeutic visitation. That's why I asked. But when we do therapeutic visitation, it's a much more controlled environment, and there's a reason that the word therapeutic is in there. That it's really meant to see if you can foster the relationship. But unsupervised and unwatched visitation is pretty difficult to control. So.
Yeah.
So what about the rest of you guys? Anybody else want to add to this party?
I just have a quick question. How is the mom able to do therapeutic visits and unsupervised visits at the same time?
I was kind of wondering that myself.
It makes no sense.
The case manager set up an appointment with a therapeutic, I guess, counselor. And the mother is supposed to contact the therapist, tell her where to meet her with 3 children. And the therapist is supposed to meet her there and spend 1 hour with her, and then the therapist will leave. She's only participated in it 2 times. And from what I can tell, it hasn't been going very well, but it is court ordered. We've been asking for it for a long time. So she did participate 2 times in the last 3 months.
Okay, so if she has therapeutic visits, then I don't want maybe it's a different county or something. Because in Hillsborough, if you have therapeutic visits, that's considered your visit. You don't have a unsupervised visit. Therapeutic is therapeutic. You don't have one or the you have one or the other. You don't get both.
Joe, and what you have to realize, this case has gone on for almost a year now. So we went through the supervised visits at a visitation center, then it progressed to unsupervised in a public place, and then the visits started traumatizing the children, and that's where we pushed. So they're just trying to make sure that the at least the 1 hour of time there is someone coaching and observing. But like I said earlier, this mom has presented lots of documentation to the court that would show, oh, she's entitled to her visits. So we're just thankful for that 1 hour, at least, to have someone really paying attention, because the FSWs in our county were not supervising to our satisfaction. And that's why things were said and done that, upset the children during the visits.
Actually, Joe, I had the same question, so thank you for asking that.
Yeah, it's just mind-boggling that they would. So if the children are being affected by the visitations, then you guys should be able to go to court and request for, because you can request to have because technically once they approve the unsupervised visits, then you have to go back to court to have the unsupervised visits recanted to supervised visits. And then you guys should have recanted the unsupervised visits to go back to supervised with a therapist involved.
But
I know she got all this documentation, so it's probably different.
It's her word against our word. So a judge looks at all these documents, and even in the therapy reports or therapists' reports, they kind of tippy-toe around anything. And this mom, she's smart. She'll put on a show when necessary. And she, I'll give you an example. She was expecting another child, which no one knew until the very last minute. But she lost that baby, but she shared with her oldest child, not only that his baby brother died, but she showed him a picture of the child, and evidently showed him, I think she had a C-section. I mean, you don't tell a child this, I mean, she just does all these crazy, inappropriate things that no child should have to tolerate.
How old are the children?
George is 9, right, Michelle? And the twins are
4.
4.
And they exhibit all of the signs that you have listed in your presentation about trauma and delay and speech issues. They're all there. So I guess I'm just wondering if anybody's had any success in convincing the court and or the case managers that even though we can't see the injuries, that the injuries exist and are causing regression and mental anguish.
Well, the 4-year-olds are a little young for having conversation with the judge, but maybe the 9-year-old has enough worldly experience to be able to communicate with the judge on how he's feeling when he's with his mom.
So if I heard correctly, Susan, there's a lot of what it appears to be is that there's disagreeing parties. So because what'll end up happening, I have a similar case, like we're in the middle of it. And the parties are disagreeing. So the judge is like mediating and giving a middle ground. Okay. Like we want the reunification to occur because we think that that's in best interest according to one party, and the other party is saying, no, not yet. There needs to be more supervision. So with that being said, there's somebody in the middle who has to kind of come in and be that person to be that middle ground to kind of appease both parties. And that's what it sounds like the judge is doing. And what he's or she is probably waiting for is one party to drop the ball. Unfortunately, I don't know how much time you guys have because you're saying your year is almost up. But or how much time the judge will give with the different case plan that they have made for this particular case, and how much mom's followed through with the case, mom has followed through with the case plan. But so what I have seen in the past is that it ended up happening where one person dropped the ball. And in a case where I've seen it in the past, the mom ended up dropping the ball. And so it ended up working out in the favor of the GAL. Like when they were saying, no, mom shouldn't have custody. This is not right. This is like all of that stuff came to a head and they saw it. So I'm just going to tell you guys, hope for the best because I've seen it happen where it can, and those kids can end up in the right place. But you just kind of have to play it out. So.
And, part of the problem, and of course, we all know that, the 1-year mark is not in stone. If things are looking good, they'll give mom or dad more time and things like that. But in this situation, there's no perfect solution. We honestly don't want to see reunification with the mom because despite the fact that it all looks great on paper, that she's done X, Y, and Z, she still is inflicting mental and emotional harm on these children. But there's no appropriate family member, can't close it out PG with them in foster care, although our attorney is going to see if maybe we can, because she says even though the department doesn't like to do that, they have done it in the past. And she is a CLS attorney who has now come to the guardian ad litem office. So we're going to try to work for that. But it's just unfortunate. The kids are real sweethearts, but their behaviors, especially after seeing their mom, are just unbelievable. And to the credit of this foster mom, what she has tolerated and will still love on those kids. They'll smear feces on the wall and do horrible things. And she has just been amazing. So we're so thankful for her because somehow they wound up in the right foster home, because other people would have said, get them out of here. But we'll see.
Just one other quick question. Do the children have individual therapy?
Yes, they do. And they do have a therapist who agrees with the GAL perspective.
Okay.
They also, George, the oldest one, has a psychiatrist who wrote a letter, and that should be status to the court today, recommending that they not have interaction with the mother indefinitely. So I feel like we have a lot of support, and hopefully when we go to court next, the judge will see that.
Sounds like you might be on the right track at this point. As judges do tend to bow to psychiatrists, so.
Well, that's good news then.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say.
Can I just add one? Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I have a quick, when I did case management, I had an incident where we had to have a therapist involved, but the therapist whenever the kids would go with mom, they would come back to grandma, and then all this chaos would happen when they return back to grandma. And whenever they return back, the kids would not say what was going on or anything like that. But when we got a therapist involved, and the therapist was able to, over time, with the therapist involved, the therapist was able to distinguish between mom telling them, go do this to grandma's house when you get home, and stuff like that. So when we brought it to court, with the therapist, because they do like a recommendation, whatnot. So when we brought that recommendation to court, the courts ended up making the decision to say, okay, well, mom does have unsupervised visits, but she needs to move back towards supervised visits, because during her unsupervised visits, she's putting all these things in these kids' heads, and they're going back to grandma's house and destroying her house. So maybe that's the type of situation that is going on with her unsupervised visits that is happening. Maybe she's telling them to go back and do this and go back and do that, because she's probably upset, and the kids, at the end of the day, something happened to get the kids removed, but the kids go always love their parents either way, and they always gonna love mom, so they're gonna revert back to her no matter what.
Okay.
In every single visit, they're gonna revert back to mom, and mom is gonna be the hierarchy of anything. So when they go back to this caregiver's house, you're not mom. So whatever was discussed during these visits is gonna return back to her house, and she's gonna take the downfall for it.
That's right.
I think he said exactly what I was going to say. Removing the mother just so sudden, it's not going to work. You have to do supervised visitation, because the kids love their mother. And if they're behaving that way when they get back to the foster home, it's because they want to go back to their mom. So if I behave this way, they'll send me back. So cutting off hotel visitation is going to make the children regress. I mean, get worse until they get better. Not that there's not hope. And I'm saying that because I've experienced that. But when I did foster care, it was a lot different from now, because there was a panel and I could always say what I needed to say about the mom. The mom was there, she would show up. And so it was a different time. Like Barbara said, it was a lot different then. But I think supervised visitation is what should be recommended.
Thank you.
Welcome.
So now everybody has given you their opinions. So maybe you should let us know how all this works out.
You all so much.
You guys, we are not that far away from you. So if ever there's a time that you just want to staff a case unofficially, all you have to do is call. I mean, we're certainly willing to listen to you. We've all gone through this 1,000 times, and it's a very imperfect system. And we all kind of have to support each other, because sometimes it's like Carol always says, we don't get to make the call. We have to support the kids on the journey, but we don't always like where they end up. So it's a difficult field to be in, and you guys are volunteers, so you don't even have a paycheck at the end of the day to make this better for you. So, but I'm going to let everybody go. I really appreciate everybody's input, and thank you for helping our GAL colleagues. I don't know if we helped you as much as commiserated with you, but I will be sending you the GALs. I'll send you certificates, and then everybody else will get the training credits. I think Elizabeth, Carol, I think it's just Elizabeth and Carol that need CEUs. So, and I'll probably be doing that tomorrow. So, all right, you guys, I always appreciate you coming, and I appreciate your input. And I will go ahead and send Sandy the yearly calendar, so you guys can see if there's anything else that you want to come to.
Thank you.
All
Terrific.
right.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thank you.
Have a good one.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Have a great day.